Howdy. Oh, we live? Everything going great? Howdy, I'm Jeffrey Snover. Today I'm joined by superstar Jason Helmlich, and we're going to talk to you about our PowerShell journey. So let's first talk about COVID-19. Wow, what an amazing time, right? Things have gotten very strange over the last year, but it's a good time to kind of get in focus this idea that we've said forever, and that is that the world always has been, the world is, and the world always will be messy. And so, in particular, this time of COVID really is highlighting these values of why adaptability, why resilience, why robustness, and why automation are so critical, right? They've always been critical, but now we're seeing why they are so critical. And really, this is what I like to call the F5 moment, the refresh moment, if you will, right? This is a time to, figure out what things are serving us and what things are not. And it's time to invest in the things that serve us. And in order to do that, you have to drop some of the things that are not serving us, okay? And we'll be clear about what that means. And really, I'm just thankful that we have the opportunity to leverage technology so that we can continue on, not really as normal, but in a different way. We're able to connect here virtually, and in some sense, this is better, right? It would have been much more difficult for, here it is, what is it? I got up at 6 this morning to give this talk, a little bit inconvenient, but it's fine. Whereas if, we were doing this in person, I'd have to travel to Brazil. By the way, I'm very looking forward to that. But the overhead of that would be much harder as well, the travel involved. So technology is showing us new ways to do things, and I'm really thankful that technology allows us to connect in this strange time. Now, you might have heard Teams, right? We're doing this over Teams. Teams adoption has been incredible. People who had Teams and used it occasionally are now using it all the time. People who didn't have Teams are licensing it, and the usage numbers are just skyrocketed. It's hard to overstate how much Teams has scaled. And here was one of the headlines that said, usage had gone up by 12 million users. That's not the story. This is a very old story, but basically, in 1 week, we had like 12 million new users. Now, can you imagine your boss tapping you on your shoulder and saying, hey, Jeffrey, just, everything's going great. Yeah, great. I need 12 million users next week, right? 12 million users. And by the way, using it all day long. So you can imagine the sort of drama required to support this scale up. And indeed, when this happened, it was one of those all hands on deck situations. And they tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, Jeffrey, we need you to be the executive incident manager as we expand things in Europe. The adoption in Europe was huge, and we were trying to shut a bunch of things down, fire up, find new capacity, get teams everywhere. And honestly, there were a few times there where the wheels on the bus got a little shaky. But here was the thing that struck me. As I was the incident manager, got up at 3 a.m. every day to help support the team as they dealt with a bunch of the issues. What I saw was that PowerShell was everywhere. We were using it for diagnostics. We were using it for operations. We were using it for provisioning, for repairing systems. And I will tell you that in that time, in that stressful time, PowerShell's verbosity and clarity were really, gifts, right? There's no kind of like, oh, run the blah, blah, blah command. It's like, what? It's like, run the reboot cluster command. Like, oh, I know what that command's going to do. I bet you it's going to reboot the cluster, provision VIP, you knew what was going on. And it was really quite a gift in what was otherwise a very stressful period. And just to be clear, we were automating up and automating down, which is to say, yeah, we were buying as many x86 servers as possible. But the reality was that wasn't enough, right? It takes a long time to provision these things. So to get the capacity, we had to shut things down and then reuse the servers and then use them for teams. And guess what? It was successful. It was wildly successful. And so this was really where cloud architecture, automation, etc., met its goal, right? There was no way we could have done this without PowerShell. Now, Clausewitz, a famous theoretician of military, said that to secure peace is to prepare for war, that you have to prepare for war in order to secure peace. Well, I've got a variation on that, and that is to secure calm is to prepare for drama, which is to say we need to prepare for drama in order to have things be calm. And so we had done years and years of preparation, the capacity to automate everything. And then when there was this drama, things were relatively calm. Yeah, there were some issues here and there, but it's like, yep, click, 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 think about what you want, type it and get it. Worked out really well. And so really PowerShell 7 has been our 20-year story to prepare you for drama. And so I thought we'd go through that journey. So first, if we're going to go through a very short version of that journey, but if you want to know how PowerShell got started, and it really is quite an interesting story with a lot of interesting characters, Don Jones has written a very good book about it. He went and interviewed a bunch of the people at the early days, and he wrote a book about it. And the thing I love about this book is, honestly, if we're just being honest, I get way too much credit for PowerShell. I was very public figure for PowerShell, but the reality is the thing I'm proudest about PowerShell was that I was able to create an environment and a context and a set of principles that allowed superstar engineers to come in and add their brilliance in a way that added up. Microsoft is always good at hiring awesome people, but we've not always been good at creating a way for their IQs to add up. And they really did in the case of PowerShell. And the thing I love about this book is you get to understand all the awesome engineers involved in PowerShell and what their contributions were. So really, really quite an awesome book. I encourage you to get it. So everything in PowerShell is sort of grounded in the sacred vow. And the sacred vow is, look, I know your hair's on fire. The last thing you want to do is to stop doing what you're doing and to learn PowerShell. And what I said was, hey, here's our sacred vow. Indeed, learn PowerShell, and your value is going to continue to appreciate over time, which is to say that your investment in learning PowerShell is going to be one of the most best investments that you've ever made. And why is that? And that is because we're going to continue to invest. We're going to invest. And as new problems come about, you can continue to learn PowerShell over and over again. By the way, this is a bit of a reaction to the Unix world. If you take a look at Unix, and you take a look at the bookshelf, you got shell, and then you got awk, and then you got Perl, and then you got this, and then you got this. And every time there was a new problem, they created a new tool. And so you always had to I'm an expert at awk. Oh, this problem, it's not going to help me. I got to learn something else. Oh, okay, well, now I've become an expert at Perl. Oh, well, this problem came up. Well, that's not going to help me. I got to learn a new tool. And we did not want that. We wanted to say, hey, learn PowerShell, and we will invest in you. Jason, you want to talk about the evolution of PowerShell?
Well, yeah, Jeffrey, but I got to catch up for this presentation. I'm reading the book real quick, so just wanted to make sure that I was all ready to go for this. First of all, I just want to say thanks everyone for being here, and thanks for having us during this. And I'm going to request control here, Jeffrey, and run the slides a little bit. I just wanted to point out that the sacred vow is a very important thing. It's got a tremendous amount of value. And I used to think, well, I'm a product of the sacred vow. How great is that? But it turns out we're all products of that sacred vow. We're using PowerShell today because that sacred vow was held to, and PowerShell grew to meet all of our automation needs. And so where are the slides? Let me ask, does anybody see a slide up? Oh, okay. Let me see if I can advance it. Oh, I think I advanced the slide in a little too far. It's a little tricky on this. Here we go. So first of all, let's talk a second about PowerShell 1.0. And think about this for a second. This was an amazing time. So November, was it 2006, the PowerShell released, but what really was going on at that time if you were back there, think about this. We could automate things, but what we really couldn't do, we couldn't automate it very well because you had a whole bunch of little language stringing things together. You know, there was Rex, there was AutoIt, there was so many different languages, and each one had a little bit of expertise, a little bit of value in one area. But if you wanted to automate stuff, you had to string these languages together. Boy, that wasn't brittle or anything. And this was a real nightmare. It was making things impossible to scale. So a lot of us, when PowerShell first came out, we saw it as Monad, and then when PowerShell 1 released, here was an opportunity for something that could grow with us. We just didn't know. But if you think about it, released with Exchange. So Exchange now allowed us, those of us working in larger scale messaging and management, we were dying under the weight of that management, but now with PowerShell, we could start to get control. Think about this. Today, you don't even think about it. I need to change a property on 1,000 mailboxes. It's like, okay, it's a no-brainer. I'll just do this and bam, I'm done. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that was a planning process. How many people, how long is it going to take? So here's what PowerShell 1 did is it got rid of a lot of drama really fast. It really did. And it brought some common functionality together. You could work with the registry, you could work with files, but more importantly, PowerShell was extensible so that you could work with WMI. You could collect inventories from all of your hardware. Before that, you had to install something like System Center Configuration Manager, a great product, but a pretty heavyweight install just to get an inventory. Also, you could reach into the .NET framework and have complete control over whatever you wanted to do. But let's face it, that took some extra skill. You needed to already come to the table with quite a bit of programming skills to be able to do that. Well, that's part of the evolution in this sacred vow. PowerShell grew. And suddenly, and really, Jeffrey, this is kind of a great time frame when suddenly out of nowhere, and I say nowhere because, using Autorest to build all of this, but suddenly we got a tremendous amount of commandlets. Now, remember, PowerShell 1 started with 129 commandlets, and I think PowerShell 2 had something like 236. With PowerShell 3, suddenly we got thousands of commandlets in these different areas that we needed these commandlets the most. It meant that as an IT admin, I didn't have to have those deeper programming skills to understand how to work with .NET. Now I could take what I had gotten from the Sacred Vow, my knowledge of commandlets, how they worked in the pipeline, how to use the help, how to read the syntax, all of those skills, I now had thousands of them that I could use and string together to solve all of these technology problems. And Jeffrey, I have to say, while PowerShell version 2 with remoting was one of my favorite things, I think I don't know about you, but this seems to feel to me like when people really started to adopt and use PowerShell when they had all of these commandlets available.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, this is when we always talked about a world where you want to think about what you want to type, get, you think, type, get. And in reality, if you have a commandlet for the area, you can do that. But in the past, it was like, well, do I think about COM? Do I think about the registry? Do I think about WMI? And most people don't think about those things. This world is like, yes, you can do all those things, but now you can think about what you want, type it, and get it.
And for many of you, this may have been a pretty major special moment in your life, especially if you work with Linux systems. And I have to say, I still have to pinch myself today about this. This, to me, is earth-shattering. That a lot of you will remember PowerShell 6 when it came out. One of the challenges is that, hey, we want to be able to bring automation solutions to where customers actually have their automation problems, which that means we've got to be able to go more than Windows, which up to this point, PowerShell was Windows PowerShell, and what an excellent way to work with Windows. But we needed more. We needed to be able to get out there cross-platform. And the amazing thing is .NET went cross-platform and PowerShell followed behind it. And so with .NET, with .NET Core and with PowerShell having cross-platform capabilities, now we got to look beyond those thousands of commandlets, which we already have, into bigger scale management problems that we're facing everybody. So of course, today we've got things like the cloud, not just Azure, but everybody's cloud that you have to work with. We've got new technologies like Kubernetes and Docker. So PowerShell must not only keep growing for all these technologies, but now it grows across platform. And I want you to notice there's a little piece of the little bubble sticking out at the bottom there. And the reason that piece is sticking out of the circle is because some of you will know this, that in this part of translating, PowerShell to be cross-platform, we moved from the full .NET framework to .NET Core, which reduced some of our capabilities. And some of the commandlets that you had been using didn't work on PowerShell 6. Yeah.
Can I add a point? Do you remember how much we increased the price of PowerShell when we went cross-platform?
I'm trying to remember, was it 4 easy payments of absolutely free? Was that what it was?
Exactly. Now think about this. So this is the point I want to make, right? And we are in a very special position. I'm not sure how we got there, but we are in this very special position where our team, we have spent, literally tens, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars invested in you. Right? There is no money. This is free, right? And our only goal is to help you be successful. And so when we went and talked to customers and they said, well, hey, this is great, but what about my Linux? And partners that said, hey, this is great, but what about my Linux customers? And so again, because our focus is on making you successful, we went and invested an incredible amount of time, an incredible amount of pain to take this technology and port it to Linux, not to get any extra money, but to make you successful. And so, it's one of the things I continue to pinch myself, like it's amazing that we have this opportunity. By the way, just to be clear, the reason why we believe that when you're successful, when you can manage things easily, you will use more computing. We believe that the rate of computing natural rate is much higher than it actually is because management's been so difficult. So in the end, we do benefit, but it's a pretty amazing story.
Yeah, and I think, Jeffrey, one of the 2 things off of that. One of the things that I think a lot of people forget about is that, when PowerShell came out, there were a lot of us that did not think that. I mean, let's face it, Jeffrey, what part of the word Windows don't you understand? This is Microsoft. They don't make command line tools. So a lot of us didn't think that there's no way that this is going to happen. I think it's a huge testament. And I love the fact that in the book, Shell of an Idea, that this conversation you can read more about this, that, Microsoft, whether it's grudgingly at times or not, Microsoft has put in a huge amount of investment into making PowerShell a reality for all of us. And if you're taking a look at the slide right now, here's another example of this. Right now, when PowerShell 6 came out, huge investment to make this happen. But think about this time period. This was a few years ago, about 4 years ago, something like that? And if you put, I spend a lot of time talking with folks, and if you put a Windows admin and a Linux admin sitting next to each other, these people hated each other. They wouldn't talk to each other. They had nothing in common. No matter, they would throw things at each other. Well, today, and let me see if I can get my slide to move over. Today with PowerShell 7, here's a great example. PowerShell 7, we've improved our capabilities. .NET Core also extended its capabilities, and now we have an amazing amount of commandlet coverage. We have the ability to even run some of the commandlets with the Windows compatibility layer that maybe you weren't able to run before. But here's the best part. Now, because of cross-platform, when I am talking to people and I've got a Windows admin and a Linux admin in the same room, they're actually talking together because they work together. And the best part is they're sharing ideas about how to do management and automation, because the Linux admin can learn some things about Windows and the Windows admin can learn things about Linux and about automation. So now PowerShell brings people together, and that's really it sounds kind of, it's kind of weird, man. You just want us to hug it out? Yes, because PowerShell 7 is, and Jeffrey and I will joke about this, the one tool to rule them all. The idea is that sacred vow continues to be filled today as building on with PowerShell 7. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk about and show you some of those things as PowerShell continues to grow. But keep in mind, we are still working hard. PowerShell is super, super, super famous inside of Microsoft. Microsoft loves PowerShell. So if you're thinking that PowerShell is one of these little side projects that Microsoft occasionally dumps money into, wrong. We work for Azure Compute. We're part of the cloud. This is a big deal. Jeffy, I think we're back to you. I'll give you control.
Yeah. So, when we talk about the Gestalt of PowerShell 7, right? So really, there was Windows PowerShell, right? So Windows PowerShell ran on Windows only, and it did simple automation and management of Windows servers and clients. Then we had PowerShell Core, right? So PowerShell Core was the new name that we created, and this was the cross-platform PowerShell. And again, the reason there was, hey, it didn't do all the things that Windows PowerShell did, and it was cross-platform. So what its gestalt was that it enabled universal automation management across operating systems and clouds. That was awesome. But then I had these two different things. Hey, well, PowerShell, it's a, blah, 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 all these adjectives, right? And now we get rid of the adjectives or qualifiers. There's just PowerShell 7. PowerShell 7 is the thing that enables automation, management, deployment of all your clouds, on premises or hybrid resources at large scale and large complexity. So there's no qualifier here. It's no, well, this one's for Linux and this one's cross-platform, but this one's on Windows, but it does more. No. PowerShell 7 is the thing that does it all. So that's the one you want to get on.
Hey, Jeffrey, you want to flip there? Perfect. And here's a couple of, that sacred vow, it keeps coming back. And the idea is that we want you to know that we're working hard because we're thinking about you, because you remind us to. You come out to the community. And I want to talk more about this here in a little bit, but the community support that we have is paramount, because it's from you that we learn where we need to make some adjustments, some additions, where we need to build new features, how we keep that sacred vow. A couple of examples on the screen. In fact, I want to show you just a quick demo of a couple of these. But first of all, if you've noticed with PowerShell 7, we improved for each object. For each is a wonderful tool to be able to use, but when you're doing for each, you can run across some situations where you really want multi-threading, but you don't want to have to know how to write code to do multi-threading. You just want to do stuff faster. So you can. So large file moves, VM moves, that kind of stuff, log analysis. You can have multi-threaded with a for each object, but with great power, remember, comes great responsibility. Be careful how you use this. You can also hurt yourself. Remember, you can bury the network and you can bury machine performances. But the idea is that we're constantly trying to improve both PowerShell's performance and its usability to you. How many of you noticed the change in the error views? And I just want to show this real quick. And I'm also going to show you the backwards compatibility for support of other modules while I have this up. So let me share my screen real quick. And yes, I would like to share. And here's the fun part. It's early morning here and in Seattle. So let's see how my fingers work this early in the morning. First of all, I'm going to go to a Windows box, and I'm going to go to Windows, and let's go to PowerShell 5.1. Oh, I love Windows PowerShell 5.1. And here's an error that occurs. Let me just smack the screen. You get the idea. You would get these giant errors on your screen, and that's not a problem. But if you ran a script or something, this pretty much could fill up your screen. And while there is extremely valuable information, there was a lot of thought that went into crafting these error messages. A lot of people, they get inundated. Their eyes just get, oh, I can't read this. So one of the things we did, well,
you're running on a Mac, right?
Oh, yeah. I didn't know if I was going to point that out.
Oh,
yeah, and just so that everybody knows, yeah, of course we're going to do demos with, on the Mac as well. That's great. So you notice that we improve the errors so that if you do something here, you start to get a much shorter message. If you try to, divide by 0, you guys get the idea. You'll get these shorter messages. In other words, we're hoping that this clarifies what the problem is and it stands out to you so you can take action. And one of those actions might be to get more information about that error messages. So we added get error so that you can get a much more deeper dive into what that error message is. But there's something else that we want to do. We mentioned this a little bit earlier. I want you to take a look at my screen here. Let me clear it up a little bit so that it's not so messy. And let me show you something. Let's do this. Let's do Git module. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to look for, I just want to show you an example, list available. I want you to notice when this comes up, Windows PowerShell 5.1 had a module called DHCP server. Do you guys still work with DHCP servers? Yeah, I love them. And this module, the DHCP server, would let you do things like, what do you say we run a command? Let's see, get DHCP server setting. And I'm just going to have it grab, you know what, I must have not have started my domain controller, but this normally works. You can see that the commandlet ran. So here's the challenge. This uses the full .NET framework in Windows PowerShell 5.1. Dump. I want you to notice where it's located. It's located where you would expect Windows PowerShell 5.1. I'm going to go over here to PowerShell 7. Yay, PowerShell 7. And I'm going to do the exact same thing, get module D star list available. And what you're going to see, or what you're not going to see, is the DHCP server module, even though I'm looking in that same location. The reason is, some of you know this, if it was something that was on the full .NET framework, we had some problems. We couldn't port it over. So we started to show you the desktop editions. In fact, if I say skip the edition check, now you'll see the module. Well, you're probably thinking, well, that's great, because in the past, I tried to load this module, it would fail. Well, not anymore. And this is the cool part about the compatibility layer that we've added to help you so that with PowerShell 7, on your Windows box, you can still run almost all of those, not quite all of them. There are still a few like ISE drives and stuff that we haven't quite figured out, but import module, DHCP server. And I'm going to say, here's the switch option, use Windows PowerShell. Now what happens is that, I don't know if some of you have worked with implicit remoting, where you implicitly remote into your box a bunch of proxy commandlets, but that's really what's happening here underneath the hood. So now get DHCP server, and the rest of those commandlets are now available to me. So this compatibility layer, keeping that sacred valve so that you could use the commandlets on Windows that you are familiar with and that you need to use for these technologies. We're always finding ways to advance. What do you think about that, Jeffrey? Kind of cool?
It's pretty amazing. By the way, just to be clear, that Windows compatibility, that's exactly isomorphic to all those other commandlets that we added in PowerShell v3, right? Because those things, most of those are actually WMI commandlets. So how does a WMI commandlet work? And the answer is you have a commandlet, you type it, you get autocomplete, etc. But then when you hit carriage return, you actually send it to via a protocol to a separate process, the WMI server. And then from the WMI server, it hands it to another process to go do something, gets the result, hands it back, And so it's exactly the same thing, except now instead of talking to WMI, it talks to PowerShell v3 or v5, and then runs the PowerShell commandlet. So it's exactly isomorphic, completely normal.
And it's so magical. It's just so magical, but it works so well.
It is. So back to the slides?
Back to the slides.
Okay. Right, and so now let's talk about PowerShell 7.1. And here what I'd say is 7.1 Wave, and I talk about Microsoft investments. So why is that? And the answer is there are two key things. One is it's a wave. You'll see that in 7.1, we did advance PowerShell, but we've done it sometimes in PowerShell and sometimes external to PowerShell. And you'll see this as a theme. We find that we can move faster and provide greater stability by shipping some things in PowerShell and some things outside of PowerShell. And the other thing I highlight here is Microsoft investments. This is now an open source project, right? And so there are things that we're going to invest in, and then the community can invest in things that they want to invest in, either in PowerShell or as part of the community. And this has worked out really well. So what things are we investing in, or what things did we invest in the 7.1 wave? One is making it easier to innovate outside of the engine. When you put everything inside the engine, it's great, but it's harder to innovate, right? It constrains some of the innovation. We find that we can move faster by doing some things outside the engine. We wanted to improve our tooling. We had this RFC process, and that wasn't really as good as it should be. We weren't as high bandwidth and high throughput as we wanted to be. And then really to focus in on this next generation shell. And when we say that, there's always been this tension between, hey, are we primarily focused in on automation, or are we primarily focused on an interactive shell? And at the beginning, we were largely focused in on automation, and now we're shifting our focus and being a better interactive shell. And it's not that we're walking away from automation. We just think, boy, that's freaking awesome. Let's go make the interactive shell as awesome as the automation is. So innovating outside the engine. The idea here is that, again, that engine needs to be fast and stable. And so you don't want to put all the changes there because you might destabilize it. So we basically have two ways to do this. One is experimental features. So there's this new feature component that we added, which is experimental features. You get experimental features, shows you what's available. Excuse me, and then you can set those. And this is where we're going to do things, modifications to the core engine, right? So new language features. Sometimes if we have a breaking change, we'll put it behind an experimental feature to get your feedback. But then everything else, we want to use modules. Okay, so PS Readline has been a module from the very beginning, so you know about that. But then we developed secret management and our secret store. Jason's going to tell you about this amazing new capability called Crescendo, PowerShell Get 3.0, notebooks, Unix completers. There's a whole bunch of things. And these are our investments in the PowerShell 7.1 wave. So let's drill into a couple of the details there. Jason, tell us about notebooks. Notebooks seem kind of interesting. What are those?
Well, you know what's interesting? Go ahead and just advance this slide so that it fills all in, if you could, please. And Jeffrey, I'm kind of interested in having this conversation with you on notebooks. Guys, notebooks let me just show this to you real quick. I have a really simple notebook example. And so that you can kind of get the idea of what we're talking about here. I'm going to bring up a notebook. So here's the idea. I would like to have a document that has living code in it. Now, I realize this is small on my screen. Unfortunately, I can't make it any larger, but I want you to notice something as I'm going to scroll down here. Here's a document that has information about PowerShell in it. And you're thinking, well, okay, that's nice. And here's a line of PowerShell code, but here's the idea. You can run this code in this document to get results. You can even go in, oh, it just gave me the help for test connection. That was great. You can go in and you can try your own code in here and run it, and it'll run. So you have a document with the code. Now, how are people using this kind of experience today? And let me just say right from the onset that different people are using this in different ways. And there's one instance where, think about this from a training aspect. This is amazing. I can show you code. You can try it. You can test it. You can play with it. You can learn it. That's great. But here's what a lot of my friends are doing. And this is why notebooks, and I want to ask you about this, Jeffrey. I think notebooks are definitely transformative because I have, and you know these people too, they're using notebooks today as their run books. They're fully documented with code in them, and they have them chained together where their run books are always up to date because they're the things that are running all of the stuff. They have complete documentation. Their admin teams can ensure that they're up to date. People can learn from them. So these have become very powerful. What do you think about notebooks?
Yeah, no, that's exactly the thing that highlighted when we were doing the Teams rollout in Europe was people would have these run books, this documentation, but then you'd say, okay, now cut and paste and substitute this and type it here, blah, blah, blah. And so I looked at this, I said, oh, this would be just a perfect example where you could have a notebook, right? Where it's like, hey, here's the documentation. Here's how this system works. Run this. If you see this, run this, etc. So yes, absolutely. I also think it's going to transform training.
Oh, I definitely think it's going to transform training. And if you want, we can go back to the slides and talk about improved tooling and go from there. But I am a huge fan of notebooks. You're going to see a lot of it. We've got it with .NET Interactive. There's a lot of great tools for notebooks. So enjoy notebooks and try them out if you haven't. This is definitely going to be a great place for expansion and help with everybody in their automation. So give that a shot.
Great. So then improved tooling, there's a new PowerShell Get 3.0. This really is just threw away PowerShell 2.0 and implemented it from scratch. It's written in C#. And really the focus here was we wanted to really just be awesome for CI/CD pipelines and serverless environments, right? So we wanted to be fast, we wanted to be intuitive, so it's much more performant, much more stable. And then this is, again, is a module, but this is such an important module, it'll become the default in 7.2. And then, of course, Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is awesome. Now, the earlier versions of Visual Studio Code, the extensions, the PowerShell extensions, had some issues. So if you tried it in the past and said, yeah, really cool, but really not reliable, or yeah, really cool, but doesn't work with really large files, or yeah, really cool, but the debugging's not quite there, try it again. This is really good. So we focused in on the performance, the stability, the debugging, and really it's really just awesome. And then, as I mentioned, improvements to the RFC process. Basically, the heart of this was, how do we grow and get faster? Now, I want to be super clear. So we have a new RFC process that's working out really well. There was some confusion in the community, which is to say people thought that an RFC, if it got approved, that meant Microsoft was going to do it. That's not the case, right? There's things we're going to, we control the RFC process because we don't want PowerShell to grow in a way that isn't coherent and cohesive, okay? But that does not mean that we implement everything, right? So if you want to go implement something, if it's in the commandlet space, generally you can just do a pull request. But if you want to make a change to the language, then it has to be coherent. Okay, but just because it's approved doesn't mean we invest in it. You have to invest in it. Sometimes we'll do it, sometimes you have to do it. Anyway, so then, Jason, you want to talk about the next generation shell?
Yeah, so folks, I want to do a quick demonstration here. A couple of things that I want to talk about is Jeffrey had mentioned that we spend a lot of time thinking about how to improve the shell. Now, that's not in lieu of us thinking about how to improve your experience in VS Code. In fact, a lot of the experiences that I'm going to show you today, we're thinking about in VS Code. So we think about both sides of this equation quite a bit, but we thought maybe there were some improvements that we might be able to make in your experience in the shell and with your automation. So let me just kind of show you a couple of these things real quick. I'm going to share my screen once again and go back to typing and oops. Just want to, there we go. So I'm going to do this from Windows once again and clear my screen. So folks, one of the things when you first started learning PowerShell is you would start to learn a commandlet and you would say, gee whiz, it takes so much to type all this stuff in, but fortunately I have tab completion. Tab completion will let me move through these commands a lot quicker. It'll let me fill in the parameters a lot faster. It'll let me fill in arguments. So tab completion was a great way to help accelerate you to being successful. Well, that's awesome. There's another thing that helped me be successful, because if you're thinking about it, I'm trying to type commands and I'm working with commands. I'm forgetting commands as fast as I'm successful with them. So something else that would be useful to help us out would be, wow, I really like being able to review my history, because if I was successful once before, it's probably in my history and I might want to be successful like that again. So things like tab completion and history can have a great impact to your success when you're working at the command line. Well, that's what we wanted to do. So let me show you. With the release of PowerShell 7.1 and specifically PS Readline 2.1, what we have is this. I'm going to show you how to turn this on and then I'll show you how to find this. We have something called predictive IntelliSense, and oh my, now I have to figure out how to remember how to turn it on because I don't have my predictive intelligence turned on. So it's PS readline option. It's going to be prediction source, and I'm going to turn it on for history. Now let me show you what the experience is going to start to look like. As I start to type, very faintly on my screen, you can start to see a line being produced from my history. Now I'm going to talk more about that in a second, but first, you can't really see that very well in my demonstration. So one of the things I want you to know is this experience is completely under your control so that you can change how it works and the colors that work with it. Let me show you one color option. This is Steve's best friend. He loves this one. And now when I start to type something like get child item, you'll see across the screen, here is a prediction of what you might want or a suggestion. Did you want this? Here is where this suggestion is coming from. It's coming from your history, not the PowerShell history that you see when you use get history. That was a session-based only history. This history comes from PS readlines history, which is across all your sessions, so it's very useful. Now, personally, this color mode is not my favorite one, so let me change it to my favorite one, a little bit easier for me to read on the screen as we kind of go through this. And I just want to show you a couple of things with them real quick. So once the color is set, take a look. I'll show you where you can find this. Today, you can go out to Find Module and PS Readline. Thank you. In Predictive Intelligence, you can accept a prediction right now with the right arrow key, accept it really fast. And in this case, you can go out and you'll see the current release that we have as soon as it comes up here. Come on, there you go. 2.1 is available for you off the PowerShell gallery. And that gives you what you're seeing right now, that when I start typing something, it will predict it for me from my history, and I can select that prediction and I can go backwards and make changes and edits and forward, and I can of course execute that prediction. Now, we thought about this, and this is what you get with 7.1 and PS Readline 2.1, but we thought about this and we're like, we'd like to make this a little bit better. So let me just show you very quickly. Find module, PS Readline, yep, allow pre-release. Thank you, Predictive Intelligence, for making that easier. And boom, there is a beta currently available. And I'm going to tell you a secret. We're actually working on getting another beta out next week. I don't know if it's going to happen, but we're trying. 2.2. Here's what you get with 2.2. You get the ability to not only have these nice predictions in what we call inline view, which is another term for this whole line completion, but you can also press the F2 key and now see a list. Oops, sorry, a weird thing keeps popping up. You can now see a list from your history of the current matches so that you can arrow down and pick the ones. And for some reason, my arrow down just stopped working. I think that's, oh, wait a minute, there it goes. You can go down and pick the one that you want, and you can flip back and forth between them, whatever you prefer to do. So this view, the historical predictions, list view and inline view, you want to see something really cool? Folks, this experience, remember our friend back here, Windows PowerShell 5.1? Still our friend. A lot of you have automation that you are still running on Windows PowerShell 5.1. A lot of you still use Windows PowerShell 5.1. Please use 7.0. It works beautifully on Windows. You'll love it. You'll never want to go back, but I get it. So these predictions work in Windows PowerShell 5.1, including list view. Now that's got to make you pretty happy, doesn't it? Now I want to show you something really quick that does not work in Windows PowerShell 5.1. There's no way that we can down level port this. This requires that you are on PowerShell 7.1 or above. And here's what I want to show you. You may have noticed this as I started typing and I'm in list view. You might notice over here on the right, it's showing you that this is coming from history. The reason that we're showing you that is that now you can also have additional providers, predictors that you want to add. And there's one that I've been working with a team, the Azure PowerShell team, a great partner. Damien Caro over there has been working on a predictor for Azure PowerShell. The idea is this, is that historical predictions, like I keep typing in, this is a great way to accelerate an experienced user who's already been successful. But what if you're a new user and you're not sure how the technology works? And I'm a new user every time I see a new command that I've never used before. Well, here's the idea, new AZ VM. Oops, wait a minute, my predictions aren't turned on. Oh yeah, I need to show you this. Set PS Readline option I wanted to show you PS readline option, prediction, source. Here, go back. History and plugin we will support 7.1 and above. And here's what you get. If I start typing new AZVM, it's now starting to predict using an ML-based predictor to teach me or help me use Azure PowerShell so that I can make a VM. Maybe, and let's go to list view here because this is kind of nice. Maybe in the process of making a VM, you didn't realize that you needed to have this thing called a resource group. Well, the best part of this is I can go, oh, okay, I didn't know I needed this thing called a resource group. Maybe I'll just do new AZ resource group. Oops, it helps if I type a little bit correctly. And it can help me, and I'm going to go back to inline view. It can help me build that. Notice it's giving me the mandatory parameters that I need to create the resource group, and it's giving me little stubs to put in the arguments for this. Here's the best part. If you're using their predictor, as you use it, it gets smarter. Here's what I mean by this. If I create the resource group and I give it a name, later when I go to create the VM, it auto-populates it with the resource group name. Now,
I missed that.
Helpful.
That's
yeah. That's so, folks, the idea behind what we're doing with predictions is it's early days. The historical predictions work really well. If you've ever seen something like the fish shell or Z shell, those are things that they have been using as well. But we wanted to go beyond that. And so we're working on this. You will be able to create your own predictors. They don't have to be ML based. Matter of fact, I have some thoughts on a few that I'd like to see inside of PowerShell all up. So we really would look forward to your feedback. The one other thing I wanted to show you real quick was I just love this concept. Jeffrey had mentioned this new thing we just released this week, our first preview. So it's early days on something that we call PowerShell Crescendo. And I'm really excited about this because my problem as an IT guy, PowerShell solved almost everything, except how many of you have been sitting at this prompt and you've gone, oh boy, I'm really about to hate life. In other words, you have to work with a console command that is, and I'm going to turn off the list view, but you get the idea. You have to work with a console command that you already know. You're just going to have to start Googling around, binging around, trying to find it. It's a real pain. You also know this, that when you work with one of these, like my favorite one that I'm going to be using right now, ipconfig, when you run it, the results you see on your screen are just for you on your screen. You can't use them for anything useful in a pipeline. So if I'm trying to pipe this and I just want the IP4 address because I want to use this for automation and I want the IP address, you know it's going to fail. Native commands.
This is that messy world. Right, that messy world, right? This is the original messy world, right? Like, what does -L or -L mean? You know, what's parameter is that? On Linux, you have no idea, right? And then you have text, as what I call this is the prayer-based parsing, right? Cut off 3 lines. Oh no, it's 4 lines, and then go over 27 columns. Or is there a tab? Oh, God damn it! Anyway, it's just a mess, right? It's prayer-based parsing. Like you can do something and you just pray nothing changes. It's so brittle.
And the thing is that, oops, it helps if I actually accept my predictive intelligence. I just changed into a directory because I want to show you something. So this messy world, as Jeffrey describes, this is painful. If you've tried to automate native commands in your automation, this is painful. Now, can you? The answer is yes. So first of all, I need you to level set on this. If you are an experienced DevOps engineer, you're an experienced developer, you already know that if you have a native command, you can, first of all, wrap it yourself. You can write the code and do it yourself. It's not easy, but you can do it. You also know that if you know where the API is, that you can auto-rest, Swagger doc, you can write and wrap the API. I just want to point out that that skill set, very valuable skill set, is not the skill set of a lot of administrators. That goes beyond their skill set. So what we're thinking about with Crescendo is how can we try to find a way to make this easier for everybody, and so that you can wrap native commands and get them into your automation. So let me give you an example. First of all, get module. I'm going to bring up a module here, Microsoft Yeah, there it is. Thank you, Predictive Intelligence. Get module Microsoft PowerShell Crescendo. You can get this from, and for some reason it's not appearing on my system all of a sudden, but you can get this from the gallery. I don't have to run the find module for you to see it, but it's out on the gallery. It's 0.4.1. And here's what you get. With that module is the generator. So here's where that module goes. It goes on your PowerShell 7.1 or above administrative box that you want to create these new Crescendo modules with. And I'm going to show you an example. So I am going to build a new Crescendo module for the native command ipconfig. Here's what you need to do. Right now, you need to describe how you want this native command to look as a commandlet. That's all you need to do. Now, right now, we have this as a simple JSON file. The simple JSON file needs to have a schema. That's why we use JSON. People are asking, why didn't you use PSD1? We needed something we could schematize. Let me go into VS Code and show you this JSON file so that you can see what I'm doing here. By the way, I'm sorry, I'm never going to find the button for this real quick, but as soon as I find it, and I'm not used to, there it is, command palette. I want to show you a trick. We spend a lot of time on VS Code and automation, so don't just think we only do shell. Have you guys seen the enable ISE option?
It's awesome.
It looks just
By the way,
like
we're
the ISE.
running out of time, so zip it up.
Okay. Yep. So here's where I'm describing
ISE.
the commandlet. Yeah, here's where I'm describing the commandlet. I specify its verb, its noun, where that native command is listed, and I can specify the parameters that I want to use with that native command. So a very simple configuration file is all we need. And export. Oh, thank you, Predictive Intelligence. I'm going to export that to a Crescendo module, and I will list it for you. You see it down there, ipconfig. I will import my import quickly. Import module. ipconfig and get ipconfig. Woot! Now it works in the pipeline. Now it works with objects. Now it has help. Now I can automate this a lot easier. And you just saw it takes me a couple of minutes to do. Jeffrey, what do you think of that?
So it's amazing, but I want to highlight what's here, right? So PowerShell, at the end of the day, we are all focused about you, right? We want to deliver you a high-level task-oriented abstraction, right? Where you say get dash, verb dash noun, you have well-defined commandlets, you get the output in object format, so it's easy to manipulate and easy to do. And we don't really care about the implementation, right? Version 1, the implementation was C#. Then later we could do it in PowerShell. Then you could do it in WMI. Then you could do it with a REST API. We sort of don't care. And so now, and then in 7, we say, yeah, you can use PowerShell, older versions of PowerShell. And here we're saying now you can use commandlets. We don't care where the commandlets come from. We have no opinion on that. We just want to grab the world, hoover it up. Back to what I said, the world always was, the world is, and the world always will be a messy place. And we're trying to take that messy place and deliver it to you as this high-level task-oriented abstractions, right, to normalize the world. And so with that, Jason, I think you got the next slide.
Oh, do you have the slides up? I think we're just about, yeah, so what's next? Here we go. Folks, stick with us on this journey. On what's next, we've got PowerShell 7.1 has just been released last month, and we are already releasing previews for PowerShell 7.2. In fact, preview 1 is available, but secret, we're working on one for next week. Yay, another one. So we've got these coming out. Join us on this preview journey. Make sure that you stop by and you give us feedback in GitHub. Also, if you didn't know, PowerShell is available on the store. Woot, woot, woot. So you can get it right from the store. Continuing those previews, come out, give us feedback. And I just want to say to the community overall, it's thanks to you that's making PowerShell successful. So it's us working together. PowerShell brings people together. It's cross-platform. It's open. So join with us and help us make this the best product ever moving forward.
Yeah, so what can you do? So download and install 7.1. We've got a number of links here. And there's a bunch of, again, remember, there's now PowerShell and then also the modules. So you want to get very familiar with the gallery, load up your favorite modules from the gallery. And then, of course, follow the PowerShell team on our blog and on Twitter. We're very active on Twitter. And so in summary, first, thank you for your time. PowerShell 7 continues to make you more productive at scale for your cloud and your hybrid efforts, right? And we're 20 years into this journey, but it's really just begun. We continue to invest in you. And we're investing in you, you should invest in you. And obviously that's something you're doing, attending these conferences. That's a great use of your time. Really, again, this is that F5 moment. Figure out those things, technologies, habits, etc., that serve you, invest in those, and drop the things that no longer serve you. Don't just add, you got to drop things in order to focus in and invest on yourself. And with that, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great session.
Read the book. Jeffrey is amazing.
It's Rafael here, and it was an amazing presentation, Jason and Jeffrey. That was so great to have both you here, so I can make sure that you both guys just create a good atmosphere here, talk about the future and the journey of PowerShell as well. So I can see and I can tell you just thank you very much for your presentation, and you can see that you have large funds here of PowerShell funds, right? That you can see a lot of questions about it and just interest about PowerShell as well. So, and how to do more of this, automation, everything. So that was great. So it's a thank you very much for everything, and thank you for joining us, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Andrea, do you have a final message for them?
Yeah, I would like to say thank you very much for the great presentation, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Really appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers. Okay, so since we just had a great presentation with Jeffrey, Jason, talk about PowerShell, that was amazing to see here. It's the journey of this, and I'm sure that the most of people just wait for this for a week, right, and years, just wait to have both of these guys here. So now is just continue for next 2 minutes that you have before our next session, that will be with Sir Scott Hanselman, and you aren't having here with us. Hey Scott, how are you doing? Can you hear us?
Test. Hello.
Hey Scott.
Hey, are we live or are we in a middle place right now?
We're live.
Oh, I think Jeffrey's live, right?
You are live now.
Hey.
Hey Scott.
How are you, everybody?
Good. Yeah, we can start. Would you like to start now?
I'm easy. I'm going to talk for about an hour, right? Or maybe about 45 minutes, and then questions. Yes.
Yeah, it's up to you.
Excelente. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Y Jeffrey, Jason,
Great to see you, Scott.
No hablo español, solamente hablo C# y un poquito de PowerShell, pero español es un idioma muy difícil. Mi familia estamos aprendiendo español, pero my focus right now is going to be on Windows Terminal, on WSL, and some of those exciting things. May I share my screen?
Great.
Okay.
We're going to leave. Bye.
Hi, Jeffrey. All right. So we can see my screen. Yes, my friends? Excellent. Okay. So this is my Windows 10 desktop. And rather than showing you slides, I'm going to show you some command prompt tricks. I'm going to talk about the Windows terminal, why the Windows terminal is important. And I'm going to talk about WSL, and then how we use WSL, the Windows subsystem for Linux, to develop software. And while I'm doing that, I'll actually be using PowerShell, and I can show you PowerShell on both Windows and Linux. So that will be a nice follow-up from our work that we saw just now from Jeffrey. So in Windows, if I type in command and I go to the command prompt, I come to this window. And you've all seen this window before. We have the text that's being output right here, and then we have the window that painted it. Now, if I type PowerShell, Windows PowerShell, you see that it comes out blue, but the box looks the same, okay? Now, if I type PowerShell 7 for PowerShell Core, or the cross-platform PowerShell, I get another shell. So let's look at these three shells here, all right? You can see my drawing on the screen, I hope. Look at this here. If we click on the System menu and hit Properties, we click under Font right here, doesn't this dialog box look kind of old? It doesn't look new and Windows 10 and fancy. It looks old. That's because it is very old. In fact, this dialog box has been around since Windows XP, maybe even longer. If I look at the dialog box for command prompt, it looks like this. If we look at the dialog properties for PowerShell, it looks the same. So that's interesting. That is important because now what we need to do is talk about the difference between a shell and a terminal, and they're different things. Excuse me. So sometimes, even in English, these two words are confused. Someone will say, oh, what shell do you use? Oh, I use PowerShell. Someone will say, what shell do you use? And they'll say, oh, I use Windows Terminal. Well, a shell is not a terminal. The terminal is painting on the screen. Shell is listening to our typing and taking our commands. So here we see PowerShell, which is quite new, and we see the Windows command prompt, which was based on DOS, which is quite old. And those are both being presented in the same terminal. But look closely here. What's happening here? Why do I have two question marks appearing in my prompt? That is because I don't have the right fonts and glyphs, the right glyphs. The word is glyph. And a glyph can also contain ligatures. And ligatures are really interesting things. Remember just a moment ago when I said that a terminal is not equal to a shell. Look really closely here. You see this here saying not equals? Watch this. It's actually two characters, but it's presented as a glyph. There's greater than, there's equals. Isn't that strange? Here's not equals. Here's W, W, watch closely, W. Now presented in a strange way. That is an advanced technique that requires a certain font, and it requires an application that is smart. We can see here that the very old console host that presents PowerShell to us is not allowing that. So we need a better terminal. Now, I just said console host. Console host, also known as conhost.exe, that is painting the window. And that's different than PowerShell. Okay? PowerShell is a shell. Console host is either a console or a terminal. And I have a blog post talking about this. If you want to read more, you can search for Hanselman shell terminal. And I talk about pseudo consoles, and I talk about the difference between all of these different things. A terminal, that word terminal, comes from termination, or to end, and a terminal is sitting at the end of the network connection. Here's an example of a terminal. Then we turned into consoles, like this is a console here. When we look at our different consoles on Windows, we see con host, and con host is bad. We would say it sucks. It sucks because it's very old. So to make a better console, a better terminal, we created the Windows terminal. The Windows terminal is open source, and it's entirely new technology. So this is super fast, hundreds and hundreds of frames a second. If I open up, for example, command prompt, just do a dir, and see it's super fast. Even make it transparent. Notice that I've got 2 tabs. I could even go and do this, split screen. So now I have the command line on the left, and I have PowerShell on the right. I've done split screen now. And you'll notice here, I've even put a nice graphic at the bottom. So I have a lot of flexibility on how I can go and take my terminal, my console, and make it something special. Now notice here, my prompt now includes these cool glyphs because I'm supporting my fonts better. So if I go over to my personal website, which I build using .NET, I press enter. Look how nice that prompt is. Isn't that lovely? I've got a branching symbol. I can see that I'm on the main Git branch. I go to another location. You can see I have 1 additional file, 1 modified file. It's changed the color. The glyph has expanded. That is called Oh My Posh. Oh My Posh. And they've just come out with Oh My Posh 3. And you can extend and expand your terminal, and it's using special colored glyphs and cool icons. Now look at this icon right here. Let me zoom in on that. Isn't that cool? There's a little icon of a shell inside of our prompt. That is done with a thing called nerd fonts. Nerd fonts. And nerd fonts let you take existing fonts and add to them. So you could say, I really like this font, and I'm going to add 600 of these awesome fonts and a couple hundred of these weather icons. And you build your own super font. That's pretty cool. I have details on all of this on my blog. Now in the terminal here, if I take this pull-down menu and I select settings, that is going to today launch a JSON file. So I'm going to click on that, and I'll load up Visual Studio Code, and we'll look at some JSON. I've got details again on my blog and on my YouTube. You can see here that we've set the default fonts, both the size and the face. And you see where it says Cascadia Code PL. Cascadia Code is my font that I like, and PL means power line. And power line are these symbols here. You can see that one, the arrows. And those symbols are enabling powerful prompts like this. Now, you don't have to make the prompt look like that. You can add your own things. Over here, I've actually added my blood sugar. I'm a diabetic, and I need to know what my blood sugar is at all times. So I've embedded it into my prompt. You could put the health of the build, or the weather, or the temperature in your room, or anything. You have total control of what you want to do in your prompt, okay? This new prompt has been written from scratch, and it supports a bunch of new features. So we see here the ability to have custom font faces. Now I'm going to split that, and I'm going to put, there we go. I'll have the JSON on the side, and we'll have our terminal on the other side. And you notice when we drop this down, we have a list of all of the different prompts that I can have. The ones that come with Windows are the Windows PowerShell and the command prompt. That's kind of classic PowerShell. But the ones that I can add are really up to me. So for example, this PowerShell is like the one that Jeffrey and friends were using. That's PowerShell Core or PowerShell 7, and it's cross-platform. That's my main PowerShell, and you can see that it's bold-faced. It's the default. This menu is auto-populated. It's automatically populated. But then I can make my own. So for example, at the top here, I have the Visual Studio 2019 developer prompt. That's the one that Visual Studio installs. So if I say developer command prompt, you see here I've got both the command prompt and the command prompt for PowerShell. That sets up my developer path. So when I click on that, I get this familiar prompt. Here we go. There it is. Visual Studio developer prompt. I can make my own here. So I've made a copy of the profile, and all it needs is a name, a command line, and a starting directory. So for example, there's another prompt that you probably have on your computer. Some people love it. Some people never use it, called git bash. And git bash, for a long time, came with the Git source control system. It looks like this. Now, if we click up in the corner here, we might think to ourselves, this looks like the old console host. Well, in fact, it is its own. They have made a custom console. It's totally different, and they did that because the Windows console sucks. This is using a thing called min TTY. See that term TTY? What does that mean? TTY means teletypewriter. It's a terminal. And Microsoft went and made a new pseudo console. And a pseudo console is a device that allows applications to host character mode applications. We want to make sure that people can write their own consoles. So a couple of years ago, Microsoft introduced the Windows pseudo console, not a TTY, but a PTY, a pseudo terminal or a pseudo typewriter. And we talk about this and the relationship between when terminals started and when they ended. Isn't it interesting that we're sitting here in 2020 talking about the most advanced technologies like PowerShell and Windows Terminal, but we are reminded of older terminals from 80 years ago. We can see here Dennis Ritchie sitting in front of a teletype, and then notice that there's no monitor. Where's the monitor? That's because the typewriter is here and the output is input and output. The output is actually paper. That is a teletype. Then we started to see terminals that would talk to the back end. Those terminal systems are different on Linux and Windows, so that PTY, that pseudo device, is super important. We want that to be important so that people can choose the terminal that makes them happy, and they can choose the shell that makes them happy. Bash is a strange shell, though. If I click on that, I'll come out to an interesting looking command line, and I'll notice it says min GW, min GW64. What's that mean? Min GW. Well, min GW is this GNU Windows small little open source system, minimalist GNU for Windows. What they've done here is they've taken a bunch of binary files that you're used to using on Linux, and they've moved them over to Windows. So if I type ls, which is usually a Linux command, you can see I get a directory. ls. So what is ls here? Well, let's find out where git bash and mingw are located. So if we say git bash open file location, and we look at that particular shortcut, we can see that it's deep inside of the git folders. Let's go over there and look at that. Isn't this interesting? What's going on here? See all this? That is parts of mingw. We go back up, and there's bash, and there's git, and there's a basic shell. Is this Linux? It is not. And that can be very confusing to people. They feel comfortable at a shell that allows them to type ls and do things like that, but then they get confused and they think that they're looking at a Linux prompt. What you're actually looking at is a minimalist GNU for Windows. What they've done is they've taken things like ls and bash and they've recompiled them to allow us to feel more comfortable running those commands that we're used to. This is useful because it allows someone to type ls or type pwd and run a Windows application. So I could run Notepad, and here I am, and there's Notepad. But if we go back over to PowerShell, which we saw Jeffrey use a moment ago, and I type ls, well, that works too. So does that mean PowerShell is Linux? Well, it's not, because in fact, ls in this context is an alias. It's an alias to another command. So when we say ls, it's really just there to make people feel comfortable with themselves. In fact, if I type dir, which is a DOS command, that works as well. So alias ls and alias dir are both calling get child item in PowerShell. So then we have to ask ourselves what's real and what's not. If I'm over here and I'm typing ls, what file system am I on? Well, right here I'm on the Windows file system. So this would allow me to write bash scripts and build my applications, but it's not really Linux. So then people wanted to be able to run Linux on Windows. And this is where things get really interesting. The Windows Subsystem for Linux, WSL, first came out with WSL 1. And I still have some WSL 1 systems on my machine. I'm going to type WSL --list-v. You can see here I have 7 different WSLs installed. And look here. There's one running that's version 2, and then we have some version 1s right here, including this Kali Linux. Kali Linux is a penetration testing Linux, and I'm going to type WSL-D for distribution or distro, Kali Linux, and now I'm running that. Now I am in real Linux, right? Well, how real? If I type vim or vi, can I run that? It looks like I can. So that's cool. Let's go look at the task manager and see what it says about our little Linux here. So I'm going to sort by name. And immediately I notice I have a bunch of Windows processes. Here's the Windows calculator. And then I see bash. How am I seeing a Windows task manager filled with Linux process? There's bash. Do we have vim here? VI? Let's scroll down and see. Look at this. There's a Linux process running in the Windows Task Manager. That's strange. Well, what's happening there is WSL, the Windows Subsystem for Linux, version 1, is doing a thing called a Pico process. Pico, tiny process. And when it says ls, which means, list files in directory. Who does that work? Who does that work? Well, we saw that if we were in PowerShell, ls is just an alias. But in Linux, ls lists out the file. So it has to go and call a system call. It has to call a Linux kernel method. We can see here that, in fact, it's running a Windows process. Well, WSL1 does not include a Linux kernel. So it's actually lying to you. It runs the Linux ELF binaries, and then when someone wants to call the kernel, Windows Subsystem for Linux will take that call and redirect it to Windows kernel. That's really interesting. I'll show you what that looks like in another way. It can be a little confusing, but it will be worth it in the end. So here I'm just going to make a quick diagram. We have down at the bottom here the Windows kernel. Let me make one with a rectangle. Okay. Then we have Linux binaries. Those Linux binaries in WSL1 are here. The Linux binaries call into WSL1. WSL1 then lies, and by I say lies, it redirects, and the real work happens in the Windows kernel. And that's interesting, but it's not deeply compatible. So WSL1 is fast when talking to the Windows file system, but there's no Linux kernel, so there's some things that you might not be able to do, and it's very slow when you're talking to the Linux file system. And that was very much a challenge. WSL1 did not do things that people wanted it to do. So they introduced WSL2, and this is when things really took off. Take a look here. The little star means that that's my default. So when I just type WSL by itself, it immediately runs into Linux, and you can see it is really Linux. It is Ubuntu 18.04. I said WSL by itself. That means it picked the default here, which is Ubuntu. Before, when I typed WSL-D, WSL-D, I could type in Alpine. There you go. Now I'm in Alpine. Or I could type WSL Ubuntu 20.04. See, different Linux. There's 20.04. But again, because I'm using the Windows terminal, look at this. Each of those Linux is automatically detected, and I can bring them into my menu. Their menu is loaded automatically. So now watch this. Remembering, we're on Windows 10. I'm going to click the menu. I'm going to drop the menu down. Now watch carefully. I'm going to use my mouse hand to click, and I'm going to hold down Alt. So I'm pressing the Alt key. I'm holding down Alt, and I'm going to click on Ubuntu, and we'll do Kali Linux. So now I've got 3 different Linuxes in different panes, and I've got PowerShell over here. This can become really powerful for developers because this means that I can now test on different Linuxes. I can do it really, really quickly, and I can do it all from Windows, and I can do it all from the terminal. Now I can close each of these. Notice when I click on the pane, you see the little pink outline? That tells me the pane, the window pane, that is currently focused. Then I'm going to press Control W. Control W is how you close a tab in a browser, right? Well, what I've done is I've bound Control W to close pane here in my Windows terminal settings. So watch this. Control W, Control W, Control W. Isn't that lovely? Very nice. So WSL2 has a different architecture. Let's do this again. Let's open up Ubuntu, which we know runs on WSL2, and I'll run htop. You can see here I've got 20 processors. Let's see how many processors my computer has. Looks like I have 20 processors. So I have the full power of my computer under WSL, even though I'm running Linux. Now let's look in the task manager and see if we can see that htop that I'm running. You'll notice it's not there. So who is doing the work? Where's all this work happening with WSL2? Well, it turns out it's happening in this process, VM-mem. It's running a tiny virtual machine. And that's the fundamental difference between WSL1 and WSL2. So WSL2 uses what's called a utility VM, but it's hidden from you. It's totally hidden. So you can run this on Windows Home. You don't need Pro. In fact, if I go over here and I type Hyper-V, and I look at the Hyper-V manager, you would expect to see a virtual machine, but there are none. When you create a virtual machine in Windows, it's usually very heavy, it's usually very slow, you have to wait a few minutes, but you'll notice here, when I start up Ubuntu, I'll start counting 1,000, 2. It took about a second. It starts incredibly fast. And I can go here and look at the different versions, and you can see I can start up all these different virtual machines, and they will start and stop based on whether they're being used. Now, some people have complained that the memory gets used up. There's actually a memory limit that you can set called memory reclaim. So we go and talk about how this process works, and you can reclaim that memory, and there's a setting, and you can also compact the memory. So you'll notice as I'm doing my work here, my VM-mem might be getting a little bit bigger and bigger and bigger. That will then compact itself, and the memory will be reclaimed, which is really cool. So WSL2 runs on Windows Home, which is great, runs on Windows Pro. It uses Hyper-V, but it doesn't use it directly. If you go to your Windows right now and you type in features and pick turn Windows features on or off, you'll see this very old dialog box. And you can notice Windows Subsystem for Linux. And these two things, a virtual machine platform and Windows Hypervisor platform. That platform is what's needed to run WSL2. It doesn't use the higher level Hyper-V, and that's what allows us to run this on Windows Home, which is great for students. So then all you need to do is go to the Microsoft Store and then search for Linux. If you search for Linux, you can see different Linux distributions that you can download. If you click on one of those, they'll actually walk you through the process. And if you want, you can run a PowerShell command, enable Windows optional feature. And that optional feature is the same thing as clicking that checkbox in the Windows features dialog. When you go and install this from the store, you're just downloading a zip file. You're downloading a tar file. And that tar file is a real Linux distribution. These are real Linux distros as tar. They come from the store. All right. And then when they're run, we use an actual Linux kernel. So if we go over here and we go Linux kernel, Windows WSL, I believe there's a GitHub. Let's see if we can find it. There we go. Look at this. Source for the Linux kernel used in the Windows subsystem for Linux. Windows is actually shipping a Linux kernel. Okay. Hang on, I can hear my kids hollering in the background here. All right. So the source for the Linux kernel used in the Windows subsystem right here. All right. And now WSL2 is different from WSL1 because one includes the Linux kernel and one does not. They both use the same Linux distributions, but the WSL kernel the Linux kernel in WSL2 is a real Linux kernel, and that allows us to do some interesting stuff. So let's do this. If I go over to my personal website and my podcast, this is a .NET application. Over here on the left, this will be PowerShell. I can go and say .NET build, and I can build my application, right? This is a Windows application right now. I've just built it, works just great. And when I say .NET run, oops, I need to go down one folder. .NET run, that's going to start up on localhost 5000 on Windows. Cool, see it, there it is. Notice this here. This is a new preview feature coming in Windows Terminal. You see how the links are underlined in the terminal? That's very convenient. That means I can actually click on those links and start up my web server, which is really nice. People have been asking for that for a long time. So there's my podcast running on localhost 5001, running on Windows. Okay, now let's leave that. Let's go over to Ubuntu. And let's see if I can run an application from here. If I type .NET -- version, I'm on .NET 5, and I can actually say which .NET. And we see that I'm in user bin. This is the Linux file system. If I want to access the Windows file system, I have to go elsewhere. So these file systems are separate. I have to go and say mount. And you can see here we have the C drive, the D drive, the E drive, the F drive in the mount folder. So if I want to see, for example, my Windows desktop, I would have to come down here. So there's my Windows desktop. I'll make a folder here. This is an empty folder. And I'll say .NET new web application. Create an empty web app. You can see my files there. Now I could say Vim, and I could run a Linux editor. Looks like that doesn't look very good. I need to work on my colors. You can see I've got an issue with my colors of my terminal here. The words are there though. Let me try a different editor. There we go. So here's Linux, here's .NET. Now I can say .NET run. So it's going to go and build that. And this is not going to be very fast because I'm on Linux, but I'm running it on the Windows file system. Now I'm going to click on that local host. Okay. See, I get a SSL error unless I switch over to here. Now this is interesting. This happens sometimes when you share ports. This is a little bit of a subtle error here. I'll show you this. Here I made an empty web application. And you see it says it's listening. It says you're currently offline. This is using what's called a service worker. My podcast site runs even when it's offline. And I always forget how to delete these. It's somewhere here, and I want to say it's in application under service workers, unregister. Try that again. There we go. Okay. So this application runs on, I'm having some certificate issues here, runs on port 5000. And it says local host, but it's Linux. So how is it running on local host? What does that really mean? Well, if we run this application and we use a tool like TCP View from sysinternals, this is written by Mark Rusinovich and friends. I can take this application and we can see who is listening on these two ports, who is listening on port 5000 and port 5001. Let's go find it, shall we? We'll see local port. I think it's moving very fast. I'm going to slow it down. This app is a little bit silly sometimes because it's updating itself. What I want to find is port 5000. There it is. WSL host is listening on port 5000. And what that means is, as a developer, I can write code in Linux and have those ports automatically forwarded over to Windows. And that makes for a very natural and a very clean development experience. So I could go back to my home directory here. I think I have my podcast, or my home page here. Let's say .NET Run. This is now on the Linux file system. Now, this is another interesting thing that happens when you're doing localhost secure work. You see how it says you can't visit localhost because the website uses a thing called HSTS. HSTS is not Hawaii time. It's actually HTTP strict transport. And what that's saying is you've been secure once, you need to be secure always. Well, there's an edge feature called HSTS deletion, and you go HSTS delete, and I'm looking for Chrome Net Internals HSTS right here. I'm going to scroll down here where it says delete domain security policies, and I'll put in localhost. That will allow me to do my work locally here, or should, if I know what I'm doing. And look at that. So now I'm on Linux, on localhost 5001, running a secure, and it's not secure because it is a self-signed certificate version of my personal website. And that's really cool because that allows me to now do that debugging. But I haven't done anything in Visual Studio Code. I've only been doing things at the command line. Now, there's a couple of questions. First, how do I access these files if they are on the Linux file system? Well, I can do this. Remember before when I typed in notepad.exe and I was able to run stuff on the fake version of Linux? Well, here I can type explorer.exe, and I'm going to type in dot. So I'm typing explorer.exe in Linux with a dot for the current folder, and I hit enter, and watch this. Explorer starts up. Now, we didn't literally run Explorer from Linux. What we did is we ran it. Linux said no. And then Windows said, fine, I'll go ahead and I'll take care of it for you. So there was a relationship between the Linux side and the Windows side. And you'll notice that what it did is it connected to ourselves. It connected to our WSL instance over the network. So it's running a little network server there. In fact, if I click there, you can see my running instances of WSL. You see Ubuntu's right there. Now, if I open other Linuxes, Kali Linux, W Linux, Ubuntu, and I return and I refresh this, now they've appeared as well. So only a running Linux appears in the Windows Explorer. And that allows me to then dig around and look at my files. That's cool because that means I could potentially edit this code, right? I could say explorer.exe. I could look at program.cs. So I can seamlessly move between the Linux file system and the Windows file system. That dot there means the current directory. So check this out. If I say code dot and I push enter, it fires up Visual Studio Code. But look right here. In the lower corner, it says WSL Ubuntu. So it knows that code was launched from the Linux context. And this is ridiculously powerful. This is so powerful. Now, inside of Visual Studio Code, I have a terminal, just like the Windows terminal, that lets me have my Linux terminal inside of my Visual Studio instance, which is really, really powerful. Now, here's my code from my actual personal website. And when I start typing, I get IntelliSense. Where is that IntelliSense happening? How is that work happening? Well, let's return back to our diagram as we get towards the end of our conversation here. Our Linux binaries on WSL2 have underneath it the Hyper-V platform or the VM platform and a real Linux kernel. All right. And that real Linux kernel, I always forget to spell kernel. I never remember if it's E. I think it's E. I'll just spell it both ways. Okay. And then that's doing the work. And the Windows kernel is really not involved because it's talking to Hyper-V. Now, what do we do when we introduce VS Code? Well, VS Code is our code editor, and this is amazing. Watch this. It gets split in half. The VS Code client and the VS Code server. And that's what makes this possible. Where's the VS Code client running? On Windows. VS Code client runs on Windows. VS Code server is a, look at that, it's a Linux binary. It runs there. So how do we talk to them? How does the Windows Code client, VS Code client, talk to the VS Code server? Let's find out. Turns out all of the work that's happening here in the background in our terminal is being done by, looks like my text, my colored text is not very awesome right now. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see that. I apologize. You see it says VS Code server right there. I'll try top instead of htop. Looks like it's a little hard to see. I apologize. That Visual Studio Code server is actually located here. In Linux, when you type code dot, what happens is a server gets installed that is the Visual Studio Code server, and then inside it are extensions. Look at that. I've got C# and Python and Jupyter and C++ extensions running in Linux. So here, when we look at this corner, when it says WSL Ubuntu, it's connected to WSL, and I say file, open file. Notice that dialog box is not the Windows dialog box. That is the Linux file system. That is the Linux file system. If I click Show Local, that's the Windows file system. See the difference? File, open file, and now I can open up those files directly. All of that work, though, is happening here in the Visual Studio Code server. To work on my colors, it looks like. All right. So then what this means is that I could potentially put a breakpoint somewhere, press F5. It will automatically call .NET Build and do all the things that I want to do. Look at that. Fires up my browser. I have to think about my SSL situation here. And there's my application. That is live debugging of a .NET application on Linux. You can see that it's on Linux by looking at this path, except I'm using Visual Studio Code to do the work. So that's exciting. But what about Visual Studio full-sized? Well, Visual Studio proper, Visual Studio 2019, now supports WSL2 as well for .NET debugging. So I can use IIS Express, I can use Kestrel, I can use Docker, or I can use WSL2. That works well here. And that's also got inside that developer command shell. So we can access PowerShell inside of Visual Studio itself. Look at that. That's the developer PowerShell inside of Visual Studio, and even the fonts and stuff look great. So there's so many choices right now. It can be a little bit overwhelming, but let's think about those choices as we get towards the end of our chat here. We can use WSL to do Linux on Windows. I can use VS Code, or I can use VS 2019. They both support .NET, and they both allow me to do that WSL debugging. So I can be on Windows, I can target Windows, or Linux. And then finally, I can also run Docker. And Docker, you might have noticed a few times, has been showing up when I type in WSL -list-v. Docker Desktop shows up right here. That's because Docker uses WSL2 to run Docker. And I've actually got Docker build files here. Jeffrey Snover will appreciate this. Those Docker build files are PowerShell scripts. And if you look at one of them, you can see that they work on Linux as well, because I've added what's called a shebang. And that shebang at the top there allows a script to run on both Linux and Windows. The extension allows a PowerShell script to run on Windows, and the shebang makes it run on Linux. So now I can go and Docker build my application on Linux or Windows, and it works just fine. It makes my experience very nice and clean. So now when I'm doing that, look, I'm going to build my podcast on my local machine here using Docker. I can go and look at the Docker front end, see that work happening. You can see all the different images that are being built. You see this podcast image right now is going to be updated in a moment. I can even run unit tests. The unit tests are running inside of Docker in this case. Look at that. See, it's updating inside of the Docker UI. So you get this very nice user experience inside of the Docker for Windows UI. Now it's going to update that. You can see that there we go. Look at that. Less than a minute ago, the Docker podcast container has been set up. And then I could go and say Docker run. And we'll run that one. And then that's fired up. And now I'm running my application in the context of Docker running under Linux, but I ran it from Windows and PowerShell. Pretty exciting stuff. A lot of powerful things happening. I truly believe that Windows is becoming a wonderful, wonderful development box, and certainly I like it more. I prefer it more to a Mac. So let's go through some of the questions and answers here, and take a look at what we've got here. So I see a question from Andre about plans to support systemd in WSL2. There are a number of things that we'll talk to you about how to do that. The intent is to come up with a way for it, but there are already lots of third-party solutions for those things. So a number of different ways, but yes, there is a discussion about that on a GitHub issue, and you can go and learn about that. So yes, systemd is on the plans, but doesn't support it yet, but there are always ways around it. Now, Arthur has a great question saying, can you clone a GitHub repo in the Windows drive and run in the Linux distro? Yes, but there are performance ramifications. Let's take that question. I'm going to copy and paste Arthur's question. I'm going to put it right here. Clone a GitHub repo. Let's break this down into the Windows drive and run inside of Linux. Okay, so here's Linux. I'm in Linux right now. I can go over to the D drive, which on my machine is where my GitHub things are. And I can find my Hanselman code. So I am in Linux on the Windows drive, which is a remote drive. And I can go and build it. Now, your question, August, is saying, can you develop the same project in both Windows and Linux at the same time? Of course, my Hanselman application here runs both in Linux and runs in Windows. I'll just go ahead and stop running that. This is a .NET application. It doesn't care where it's run. I can run it in Windows, I can run it in Linux. So when I publish it, that's what matters. So when I go .NET publish, then I would say Linux x64. But I run it in both places. For speed, though, you want to keep that on the Linux file system. So what I do is when I'm testing, I just do a git pull. So if I go over here to Hanselman and I go git pull, that is my Hanselman.com website. And I run that on Linux, and then I jump over to Windows and I test it there. So I test it in both places. And if you go to my blog or my podcast site, actually, let's go to the podcast. When we scroll to the bottom, I actually have the build server link down there. You won't be able to get to it, but I like to put the build server and the current Git repository at the bottom. So when I build it in both Windows and Linux. So you can use Azure DevOps or you can use GitHub Actions to build and test in both Windows and Linux. So absolutely, you can develop in both. I personally think you should keep them on their separate file systems, though. Andre asked about X servers for WSL2. We're going to support GUI apps in WSL2 natively soon, so that'll be coming soon. But there is an X server, I think it's called like X410 with WSL2. Here it is, X410. That's the one that I use. Yeah, there you go. X410 in the Microsoft Store, and it'll explain to you how to set up a Linux GUI desktop. So Andre, today you can hack it. Tomorrow it will be supported directly. So that's pretty cool. All right, good questions, my friends, good questions. All right, do we see any other questions? I see some published questions. Scrolling. Many Linux users are resistant to using PowerShell. Not sure if that was for me or for Jeffrey, but it's still a great question. I think it's important to separate the difference between PowerShell, the scripting language, and PowerShell, the shell. For example, here I'm in Linux. Now I'm running PowerShell as a shell. I don't usually like it as a shell in Linux. I like Bash, but I like using PowerShell scripts to automate things. So separating those things, I think, is important. That's a good idea. All right. Let's see what else we got here. Any other questions? What is the difference between running in Wayland and X in WSL2. Wayland, WSL2. Yeah, so Wayland is this compositor that allows you to do acceleration of graphics. If you're just doing X windows the classic way, you have to ask yourself, how are the pixels being generated and are they going over the network? Ideally, if you use a compositor, you're going to be able to have the GPU do the work. Older versions of X windows just kind of say, here's a bitmap. It's kind of like remote desktoping into your applications. Microsoft, I understand, and I don't work on that team, is making their own Wayland compositor. All this is going to be hidden from us. The point is you should be able to install a Linux app, double click on it, and have it just work, and it should be fast. So it is my belief that the GUI application support on WSL2 will be faster when Microsoft does it than a classic X Windows server. All right, I think we're getting towards the end there. Thank you so much, everyone, for your great questions. I want to encourage you to take a look not only at my blog, but also take a look, please, at my YouTube channel, because I've been talking about WSL there for a while. You can go up and take a look. I've got how to set up an awesome prompt, how to set up Windows Terminal. I talk about Linux on Windows, all kinds of great stuff. So please do go check out my YouTube and subscribe, and I'll show you exactly how to set these things up. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your excellent questions.
Also, Scott and Rafael here, and thank you very much for the presentation. That was great, and we just received some feedbacks here. That was amazing. All right.
Thank you.
And just how would you like to ask a question? And can you just do a favor for us and just do you have a final message to the IT community and developer communities for MVPs and all IT communities from Brazil?
I think the most important thing to remember is we who have been in technology for many years need to be kind to the people who are joining us in technology, the new people. We don't want to be what are called gatekeepers. You know, a gatekeeper is trying to prevent someone from being in technology. So we want to make sure that we're going to be welcoming. I really want people in technology to feel welcome. So we, the MVPs, we, the Microsoft employees, need to make sure that we're setting up new people for success. There's a lot of, Brazil is a huge area, Latin America is a huge area, lots of talented people. If you lift up someone else, it does not lower you. And I've tried to spend my whole career bringing new people into tech. They are not a threat to you. There are enough jobs to go around in the tech community right now. So let's make more technologists. Let's share our knowledge freely. That's my message, I think, to the community.
That's amazing message. Thank you very much for your inputs and our stuff. That was amazing. So yes, thank you very much, Scott, and really appreciate it. And thanks for joining us. And
thank you so much.
Yeah, Andrea, do you have a message to Scott?
Thank you very much, Scott. Great presentation.
I appreciate it. I apologize that I don't speak Portuguese, but I do have very bad Spanish. So maybe next time I'll come prepared with more Portuguese and I'll learn more languages.
Yeah, but tú hablas un poquito de español, sí?
A little bit. Enough to buy food, más o menos.
No problem for that, Scott. Actually, we also do have English speaking in Latin America, MVPs that was born in Trinidad and Tobago and other countries. So, in the name of all the community, in my name as
horário de Brasília, obrigado aí, Rafa, pelo suporte.
Thank you very much for your participation in such a great event. O pessoal da interação do público, vou pedir para todos vocês que estejam assistindo nesse momento ao vivo, que possam postar suas perguntas aí, possam interagir com a gente e assim, meus dois queridos MVPs aqui vão estar fazendo essa interlocução entre a gente. A ideia é que a gente faça algo bem interativo para poder esclarecer, tirar dúvidas. E aí eu queria começar primeiro, registrando que essa palestra vai ser gravada. Para aqueles que fizeram o seu registro premium, vão poder assistir gravado. Se você está assistindo gravado, prazer também que você tenha esse momento de ter se interessado pelo assunto. A gente vai falar, na minha palestra aqui hoje, a essência do Microsoft MVP. Vou falar um pouquinho do porquê a Microsoft criou essa premiação, antes de mais nada, e o que vem a ser o programa. Tá? Então, para começar, aqueles que não me conhecem, meu nome é Glauter Jannuzzi, eu sou Community Program Manager, né, apelido que o pessoal costuma chamar MVP Lead, né, líder da comunidade MVPs aqui na América Latina, que hoje tem cerca de 250 profissionais, e a minha mini bio, de forma bem sucinta, eu me apaixonei por tecnologia aos 10 anos de idade, fazendo um cursinho de informática na escola, né, Basic, e me tornei um entusiasta por programação, por desenvolvimento de software. E aí, ao longo da minha adolescência, convivi o tempo todo, né, com a tecnologia, indo atrás de livros, né, e tentando compartilhar computadores no laboratório da escola. Muito mais tarde vim a ter o meu primeiro computador, mas sempre desenvolvendo então nessa carreira em linguagem de desenvolvimento. Primeiro foi Basic, depois veio o Clipper, começando com Summer 87 e aí evoluindo para as outras versões, C, C++, Delphi, VB, passei da área de desenvolvimento, né, DOS para a área desenvolvimento Windows, ou já incluindo orientação a objeto, e aí depois peguei o início da internet, especialmente, com linguagens de CGI, de scripts como Perl e depois Java, e aí depois ao longo da minha carreira eu fui indo, me pendendo para aquela noção de carreira em Y, para um lado mais de gestão de projetos, de gestão de pessoas, para o lado mais comercial. E depois de trabalhar por diferentes empresas, né, como o Achei, um site de buscas, né, de 99, 2000, a Xerox e Unisys, eu estou há 13 anos na Microsoft, onde passei por áreas de serviços, né, de Customer Management, na área de TI da Microsoft mesmo, que eu tive o prazer de trabalhar durante alguns anos, na área comercial, né, como Solution Sales Specialist, e na área de marketing também, onde eu comecei e depois a gente mudou para essa posição que eu me encontro hoje, desde 2017, liderando essa comunidade bacana de MVPs. A gente está aqui num evento hoje promovido, criado, fundado dentro dessa comunidade, né? O MVP Conf não é um evento da Microsoft, é um evento da comunidade MVPs, especialmente da comunidade MVPs Microsoft, obviamente, mas e a gente tem muito entusiasmo com esse evento. Eu vou explicar um pouquinho por que ao longo da minha palestra hoje também. Então, eu queria agradecer, primeiro, né, os nossos patrocinadores do MVP Conf. A Microsoft é um deles, mas temos outros como a SND, a Corp, a XP, a Cloud2Go. É muito importante cada patrocinador e cada um de vocês que se inscreveram para esse evento, porque, como foi comunicado, e eu sei, né, com toda a transparência que eu participo junto aos organizadores aqui, esse evento é totalmente social, ou seja, não tem um centavo que fique no bolso de nenhum dos organizadores ou dos palestrantes. Eles são todos doados para entidades sérias, né, que são nossas parceiras aí. E para esse ano de 2020, a gente está agraciando 7 instituições sociais por todo o Brasil, né, de norte a sul, passando pelo centro-oeste, a gente tem esse impacto. E a cada ano a gente vai crescendo, e a gente tem um compromisso adicional esse ano ainda de estar fazendo um impacto ambiental também, plantando uma muda de árvore para cada participante como você, que se inscreveu aqui no MVP Conf. Então, meu muito obrigado a você, muito obrigado a todos os patrocinadores e muito obrigado também por essas entidades existirem e fazerem tão bem para crianças, para adultos, para idosos, por todo o território nacional. A gente quer impactar cada vez mais. Se você tem uma instituição que você apoia, que você ajuda, e de repente não está presente aqui esse ano, traga para a gente, a comissão vai estudar e pode estar presente aqui no ano que vem também. E aí, falando um pouco do programa, eu comecei no programa, né, em 2017, no programa Microsoft MVP. Até julho de 2017, eu estava atuando na área de vendas e fui convidado pela Microsoft para assumir a posição, que anteriormente era da minha colega Fernanda, para ser Community Program Manager, para liderar, né, um pessoal que recebeu um prêmio da Microsoft de profissional mais valioso, né, os MVPs, Most Valuable Professional. E eu assumi esse desafio, essa oportunidade, esse privilégio também de trabalhar com essa galera. O primeiro evento, o primeiro contato presencial que eu tive com eles foi em setembro de 2017, num evento que a gente fez na Microsoft em São Paulo, né, chamado Cafezinho com Jannuzzi. A gente tinha um grupo lá de cerca de 20 e poucos MVPs, né, uma mesa de café no meio, onde a gente conversava bastante. E aí um deles, por exemplo, é o Benito, que está ali no canto esquerdo, um MVP de Excel hoje, de Office Apps, né? O Excel está dentro dessa categoria, mas muita gente bacana, e alguns já não estão mais na comunidade de forma ativa, mas são profissionais que passam, deixam o seu legado também, e estão hoje fazendo outros papéis. Então, esse foi o meu primeiro contato, e eu vou explicar um pouquinho o que é, né? Por que a Microsoft criou esse programa, esse prêmio, na verdade, antes de mais nada, eu vou explicar a diferença do prêmio e programa. E aí eu vou falar basicamente a essência do Microsoft MVP em 3 poderes que essa premiação, né, e esse programa envolve. Então eu vou dividir o meu talk aqui rapidamente em 3 poderes, que vão sintetizar a essência de ser MVP, tá? Primeiro, a primeira pergunta que eu gostaria de passar para vocês aqui e falar um pouquinho é sobre por que a Microsoft criou o MVP Award. Antes de mais nada, antes de ser uma comunidade, antes de ser um programa, o Microsoft MVP é uma premiação, né? O nome bonito, né, em inglês, é Microsoft MVP Award. Então, assim como qualquer premiação, seja ela o Oscar, o Grammy, o Prêmio Nobel, qualquer uma, a gente tem critérios, tem pessoas sérias, né, trabalhando nisso. Quem está por trás, né, do Oscar, por exemplo, é a Academia de Hollywood, que é uma entidade privada. Quem está por trás do Nobel é uma outra entidade privada. Quem está por trás, obviamente, do Microsoft MVP é essa empresa que vocês conhecem, chamada Microsoft. E eu sou parte desse time que envolve uma série de pessoas, e a gente sempre tem uma visão muito clara com os valores Microsoft, com os valores de comunidade, com os valores técnicos, para poder ir atrás, reconhecer novos MVPs, né, e anualmente seguir premiando e mantendo profissionais mais valiosos em nossa comunidade. Mas respondendo diretamente a pergunta, por que a Microsoft criou o MVP Award? Eu vou mostrar ao longo da minha apresentação aqui algumas fotos, mas para ajudar a responder essa pergunta de forma bem prática, a Microsoft criou essa premiação para reconhecer, como reconhecimento ao esforço, à atitude, à proatividade, à liderança em comunidade de profissionais que não só são especialistas, mas compartilham conhecimento, se juntam, né, com outros para formar comunidades, para trocar conhecimento, informação, prática, com respeito mútuo. O MVP sintetiza um espírito de comunidade muito grande. E aí, eu peguei algumas fotos que eu tinha de alguns eventos aqui de MVPs, e aí o MVP Conf entra muito forte na minha história dentro desse programa desde 2017. Esse evento foi concebido durante uma reunião interna nossa só para os MVPs, em dezembro de 2017, um evento chamado Microsoft MVP Community Connection, onde eu estava lá, né, como CPM pela primeira vez naquele evento, com cerca de 70 ou 80 MVPs do Brasil naquele primeiro momento, e a ideia foi trazida, né, por um MVP, que está aqui com a gente, o André Ruschel, foi abraçada logo por alguns, Claudenir, Benito, posteriormente pelo Weber e alguns outros também, que começaram a ajudar, e essa corrente só foi crescendo, essa corrente do bem, Rafa está aqui, Rafa Felipe, Igor e outros mais, Ângelo, Sulamita, Rafael Bernardes, as pessoas ao redor desse evento foram crescendo. Isso não quer dizer que foi tudo mil maravilhas, foi tudo muito fácil. O caminho é muito tortuoso para chegar e organizar um evento do zero e ter, na primeira edição, como foi em 2018, cerca de 1.200 pessoas, mais de 70 MVPs palestrando, mais de 100 palestras, de diversas trilhas, né, numa universidade que abriu as portas para a gente, nesse caso a Unip Tatuapé. Um evento maravilhoso. Essa foto sintetiza o momento do auditório principal, onde a gente estava abrindo o evento também. Então, o prêmio Microsoft MVP, ele surgiu para reconhecer esse trabalho magnífico que os MVPs fazem. Conseguem transformar um evento que poderia ser mais um evento ordinário, como tem vários por aí, né, com ordem, bonitinho, bem organizado, mas tornam um evento em algo extraordinário. E assim foi a evolução do MVP Conf de 2018, com cerca de 1.200 participantes, para o ano passado, presencialmente também, né, na Universidade Anhembi Morumbi, em São Paulo, que abriu seus campos também, o seu campus para a gente, com diversas localizações ao redor da faculdade, e a gente tem essa foto maravilhosa com muita gente, né, que passou pelo evento. Mais de 2.000 pessoas estiveram presencialmente no MVP Conf 2019. Praticamente 100 MVPs palestrando, muitos conteúdos, muitas trilhas, e é exatamente por isso que a Microsoft criou esse evento. Não, de novo, não é um evento criado pela Microsoft, mas pela comunidade de MVPs. Então, respondendo a primeira pergunta que eu joguei para vocês, por que a Microsoft criou esse prêmio chamado MVP Awards, Microsoft MVP Awards, para reconhecer? Em uma palavra, é reconhecimento. Né? Reconhecer o poder daqueles que compartilham seus conhecimentos. Então, a Microsoft criou esse prêmio como forma de reconhecer profissionais que conhecem muito e compartilham. E aí, eu chego no primeiro poder que eu gostaria de ressaltar. Eu falei que eu ia falar de 3 poderes aqui, não vou falar de executivo, legislativo e judiciário, como a gente aprende na escola. O primeiro poder é o poder de compartilhar. O que essa galera que recebe o prêmio de MVP faz, e a Microsoft reconhece como uma consequência de um trabalho bem feito, é compartilhar conhecimento, é compartilhar o seu tempo, que poderia ser para a família, para o lazer, para os amigos, tempo livre, para fazer trabalho em comunidade, seja à noite, seja durante horário comercial, seja final de semana. O primeiro poder, então, né, dos 3 que eu vou falar, é o poder de compartilhar. Tá? E a partir daí, a gente tem algumas ideias, né, do que pode tornar um profissional mais valioso para nós. Tem um errinho aí, deixa eu só corrigir rápido aqui, quem sabe faz ao vivo, perdão. O que torna um profissional mais valioso para nós, para a Microsoft. E aí, em 3 pontos bem rápidos também, eu vou discorrer um pouco mais, se tiver interação, eu vou ficar muito feliz em interagir com o público, é que, primeiro, é preciso ter excelência técnica, ser especialista numa tecnologia de ponta. Segundo, ter paixão por compartilhar tudo aquilo que sabe, seus conhecimentos, que tem a ver com o poder número 1 que eu falei há pouco. E entender que juntos, especialmente com diversidade e inclusão, nós somos muito mais fortes. Então, esses 3 elementos combinados fazem com que um profissional como eu, como vocês, possa ser elegível a receber o prêmio de Microsoft MVP. Note que Microsoft MVP não é uma certificação que você vai estudar para fazer uma prova para se tornar. Não é isso. Microsoft MVP não é uma linha, um learning path, uma linha de treinamento que você vai percorrer para concluir ao final. Também não. O Microsoft MVP é um reconhecimento por parte da Microsoft, ou seja, é uma consequência de um trabalho que profissionais fazem com as suas comunidades para compartilhar conhecimento, para organizar eventos, sejam eles meetups, né? Vou falar do mundo antes de Covid aí, mas meetups presenciais, meetups online, lives em canais de YouTube ou em outra plataforma qualquer, podcasts, blogs ou vídeos no canal do YouTube, ou vlogs, etc. Participação ativa em fóruns, em grupos de discussão, ajudando outras pessoas, criando conteúdos em artigos técnicos e compartilhando, escrevendo livros técnicos também e publicando. Então, não existe uma fórmula única para se tornar MVP, mas existem diferentes maneiras para que profissionais possam ser reconhecidos como MVPs. Depois eu vou fazer uma demo no nosso portal, mas então, basicamente, eu queria que vocês entendessem que ser premiado como MVP é a consequência de um trabalho que vocês, que profissionais de tecnologia fazem com suas comunidades para impactar os seus e, em algum momento, quando há uma consistência, quando há uma história, quando há um resultado acima da média, né, um outstanding result, a gente entende que aquele profissional ou aquela profissional está preparado, está pronto para ser reconhecido e ser premiado. Existe um processo de nomeação e a gente recebe, então, mensalmente, a gente analisa vários perfis de profissionais e a gente premia aqueles que superam a expectativa mínima que a gente espera, do ponto de vista técnico, do ponto de vista comportamental, do ponto de vista de impacto em outras pessoas na comunidade técnica. Então, o Microsoft MVP é um prêmio, antes de mais nada, para reconhecer profissionais que compartilham conhecimento, que são experts em suas áreas de tecnologia e que acreditam que, juntos, convivendo com perfis diferentes e iguais ao mesmo tempo dos seus, se tornam mais fortes. Acreditam no poder da comunidade. E esses profissionais, de verdade, caminham juntos. Hoje a gente tem um grupo de cerca de 3.000 MVPs no mundo todo, em todo o planeta. Aqui na América Latina, como eu disse, são cerca de 250. No Brasil, em torno de 145 MVPs. Homens e mulheres, brancos e negros, enfim. A gente tem uma comunidade muito forte, muito capacitada, de pessoas que, muitas das vezes, existe uma amizade entre eles, outras vezes, alguns são competidores, né, no mundo externo, em termos de negócio, mas são premiados, entendem o valor da premiação para eles, para o negócio deles, mas para a comunidade que eles representam também. E quando a gente organiza um evento como esse, como o MVP Conf, ou qualquer outro evento que MVPs organizam, existem vários aqui, eu não quero citar um ou outro para não esquecer e ser incorreto aqui. E quando a gente está junto num grande evento chamado Global Summit, Microsoft MVP Global Summit, que ocorre todos os anos, e essa foto é de 2018, com a delegação do Brasil, que à época eu liderava, e a gente se encontra, é um grande momento de celebração, porque ali, nesse grupo reduzido aqui de alguns MVPs, representando todos os MVPs do Brasil, da América Latina e do mundo, a gente tem pessoas profissionais, seres humanos que erram, que acertam, mas que compartilham esse propósito maior de compartilhar o que sabem em comunidades da melhor maneira, de forma respeitosa e inclusiva com outros. E esse espírito, então, como eu estava dizendo, é que traz e dá luz para a gente entender um pouco de que há várias maneiras de ser reconhecido como um MVP. Né? As maneiras que você tem, se você não é MVP, se você já participou de várias palestras, está se capacitando cada vez mais como profissional de tecnologia, está participando cada vez mais de eventos em comunidade. Quais são as maneiras que você pode, né, utilizar para se tornar reconhecido e futuramente poder ser indicado ao programa e eventualmente ser premiado? Eu vou colocar algumas aqui, mas elas não se limitam a essas 4, mas de maneira geral, contribuindo com código para projetos abertos, através das comunidades open source, GitHub, etc. Isso é muito importante e valorizado. Ajudando outras pessoas em fóruns, através da nossa plataforma de Docs and Learn. Antigamente a gente tinha MSDN, TechNet e outros fóruns. Profissional de TI, e eu me incluo nesse grupo, a gente tem esse espírito de grupos de usuários, né, de se ajudar, de gerar fax, né, frequente asked questions, as perguntas mais frequentes, se ajudar de forma mútua. Eu sou de uma época de pré-internet, onde a gente tinha apostilas, livros, e a gente compartilhava aquilo que a gente tinha, e uns com os outros também, conversando, trocando ideia, por telefone até, às vezes, não tinha nem celular e muito menos videoconferência. Então, essa ajuda mútua também é uma forma de você ganhar visibilidade, se tornar uma referência em algum assunto, ajudando as outras pessoas. A gente tem MVPs que são mega experts e grandes profissionais que atuam em fóruns e compartilham muito conhecimento com outros. Uma outra forma, né, muito comum e prática de se tornar MVP é criando conteúdos originais, com a sua experiência, não pegando um conteúdo pronto que está lá em inglês, publicado por alguém da Microsoft, até às vezes mesmo, e traduzindo para o português. Não é isso que a gente quer. A Microsoft não busca amplificadores ou replicadores de mesmos conteúdos, mais do mesmo. A gente quer conteúdos originais. E às vezes você está num nível da sua carreira de maturidade bacana, tecnicamente falando, você tem experiências e bagagem para compartilhar com os outros, e você pode olhar o que tem por aí e falar, poxa, eu quero compartilhar algo diferente, algo que as pessoas não estão fazendo. E nesse espírito, você cria seus conteúdos próprios. Se você tem mais facilidade de escrever, usa o seu blog, cria o seu blog, cria artigos técnicos e publica, seja no seu portal, no LinkedIn ou em outras plataformas. Se você tem uma facilidade maior com vídeo na frente da câmera aqui, utilize canal no YouTube. A gente tem MVPs aqui que são realmente grandes YouTubers e compartilham muito conhecimento e tem uma legião, né, de assinantes e seguidores aí desses canais. Se você tem uma facilidade de áudio, mas tem um pouco mais de timidez ou não tem uma relação muito boa com a câmera, beleza, façam podcasts. A gente tem hoje plataformas de streaming que são super bacanas para você gerar o seu podcast, e você pode estar incluindo um monte de gente que de repente é deficiente visual, por exemplo, mas adora podcast e vai consumir o seu podcast diretamente na fonte ou através de um Spotify, de um Apple Music, enfim, de qualquer plataforma de streaming, até através de um assistente do Google ou da Alexa, da Amazon, ouvindo aquele podcast que você produz diariamente, semanalmente, mensalmente. Então, existem várias maneiras de você criar o seu conteúdo próprio. E, de novo, se eu sou um profissional que tem uma certa bagagem, me sinto apto a receber um prêmio e um reconhecimento da Microsoft como MVP, deixa eu compartilhar, não o que todo mundo está compartilhando. Se já tem alguém fazendo algo parecido, deixa eu pegar e colocar a minha marca, a minha impressão. Vou colocar as minhas experiências. Às vezes, melhor do que criar um artigo técnico sobre algumas funcionalidades de alguma área de solução, por exemplo, é mais bacana eu pegar uma área específica e compartilhar um exemplo que eu tive com um caso de sucesso ou com algum cliente que eu possa citar o nome ou não, que eu possa anonimizar alguns dados, mas mostrar a experiência bem sucedida ou mal sucedida. A gente às vezes esquece que quando a gente cria um conteúdo reportando as dificuldades que eu tive com alguma função e como que eu contornei aquilo, isso pode ajudar muita gente que está passando por a mesma situação naquele momento. Então, tem muito tipo de conteúdo original que você pode criar. A gente tem uma área muito ampla de tecnologia, então isso é bacana de você considerar, é mais uma maneira de você impactar a comunidade técnica e se tornar uma referência, ajudando pessoas. E, claro, a última maneira que eu listei aqui é palestrando, participando de um evento, seja presencial ou online. A vida vai voltar ao normal já já, então a gente vai estar presencialmente de novo. Participando também de novas plataformas que surgem, como o Twitch, por exemplo, onde tem live coders hoje, né, desenvolvedores aí que estão ao vivo codificando, e aí quem está assistindo, especialmente estudantes, os mais jovens, ou mesmo profissional mais velho de idade ou mais sênior, mas que está assistindo e está aprendendo também, com melhores práticas e às vezes com vícios também. Quem é software developer, né, quem é programador sabe que tem muita gente boa que faz um código limpo, maravilhoso, e tem um monte de gente que faz um código totalmente que funciona, mas é ineficiente, não é um código limpo, a pessoa não escreve pensando que um dia outros vão fazer manutenção daquilo. Lembrando que a tecnologia evolui muito rápido, mas existe um legado que permanece. Tem vários negócios hoje que ainda rodam em sistemas COBOL, em sistemas Clipper, e quem dá manutenção? Se alguém desenvolveu na época com um código limpo, identado, comentado, usando as melhores práticas de cada momento, você tem uma facilidade de manutenção. Se a pessoa fez os bacalhaus, né, e um monte de outras artimanhas, mas codificando de forma ruim, isso vai impactar muito a manutenção futura. Então, voltando, quando você tem um live coding no Twitch, por exemplo, você está ajudando um monte de gente a perceber como que aquele profissional codifica. Quando você tem, né, eventos, palestras, a gente teve nesses 3 dias, e hoje ainda tem muita rolando, conteúdos compartilhados por profissionais de tecnologia de diversas trilhas, não só em desenvolvimento de software, mas também em data science, em AI, em cloud e data center management, na nuvem como um todo. O Azure é uma plataforma que tem diversos serviços. Você aprende, então você se especializa e você pode compartilhar as suas experiências, os seus conteúdos únicos com as outras pessoas. Assim, você dá um passo muito grande para um dia ser reconhecido pela Microsoft como MVP. E a Microsoft reconhece de fato, a empresa inteira tem a visibilidade do que é ser um MVP e a comunidade, o mercado entende quem são os Microsoft MVPs, que basicamente são os nossos influenciadores globais. A Microsoft não diferencia a comunidade de MVPs por grupos regionais do Brasil, da América Latina, da Europa, não. A gente tem sim um time que, como eu, somos líderes de comunidades por região, para a gente facilitar a gestão dessas pessoas, a liderança dessas subcomunidades, mas olhando como um todo, a empresa enxerga os MVPs como parte de um time global de cerca de 3.000 MVPs atualmente em 2020. E para demonstrar a importância disso, a gente teve um encontro em 2019, durante um evento chamado AI Plus Tour, A gente recebeu o Satya no Brasil pela segunda vez, ele tinha vindo já antes, alguns anos, para participar de um outro evento, e aí durante o AI Plus Tour a gente teve a oportunidade de levar um grupo de MVPs do Brasil, nesse caso, que estavam representando todos os MVPs do mundo também, para encontrar com o Satya, conversar com ele rapidamente, fazer um aperto de mão, receber um aperto de mão do CEO da Microsoft, Satya Nadella, e tirar uma foto em grupo dessa que fica para a posteridade. Esses 10 que foram aí, de novo, foram representando o grupo de MVPs do mundo inteiro, não apenas do Brasil, especialmente do Brasil e da América Latina. E foram selecionados porque foram os que estavam no evento também com a gente, e a gente teve um critério antes para poder selecioná-los. Então, é uma foto que dá uma carga, um peso muito grande do que é ser MVP. E aí, eu vou chegar no poder número 2, eu falei do poder número 1, que era compartilhar conhecimento. O poder número 2 é exatamente atuar em comunidades. MVP não é um lobo solitário, não é um corredor sozinho numa prova. É ser parte de um time, de um grupo. Muitas das vezes, alguns têm dificuldade de usar a primeira pessoa do singular, o eu. E às vezes vai falar de si próprio, mas está falando sempre de nós, porque entende que não faz nada sozinho. E essa percepção de atuar em comunidades torna um profissional poderoso, torna um profissional visível para outros, cria uma autoridade ao redor daquele profissional. E, sobretudo, para ser reconhecido como um Microsoft MVP, como um profissional mais valioso, é preciso ser especialista e ter muito conhecimento técnico, obviamente, sobre tecnologias de ponta. Eu não consigo hoje reconhecer um profissional que sabe muito, como eu um dia soube, de Clipper ou de Delphi. Enfim, eu não vou ficar me alongando aqui outras tecnologias não, porque a pessoa pode se ofender, mas eu sou apaixonado por essas duas, então eu estou falando. Mas se a gente tem hoje uma gama enorme, muito maior do que há 15, 20 anos atrás de tecnologias, e eu vou colocar algumas delas para vocês aqui na tela, que fazem parte do programa MVP, é importante perceber que a Microsoft mudou muito nesses anos todos. A Microsoft é uma empresa que tem 45 anos. A Microsoft é uma empresa que se transformou muito na era da internet, aos trancos e barrancos, e especialmente nessa era de cloud, ela se tornou uma empresa totalmente diferenciada das outras. Especialmente porque a Microsoft também percebeu a importância de olhar para o ecossistema ao seu redor. Perceber que ela não está sozinha também como empresa e ela não tem que entrar em várias frentes de batalha com seus concorrentes. A transformação que o Satya fez para essa empresa, que tirou, que levou a ação da empresa de um patamar de $30 para quase 230 em poucos anos, é um fenômeno. A gente ouve falar muito hoje de startups e de unicórnios. O que a Microsoft cresceu nos últimos 5 anos equivale a mais de 250 unicórnios. E com isso, a mentalidade mudou dentro da empresa, para a comunidade externa também, fora da empresa. E, primeiro, mostrando que a gente precisava transformar alguns competidores em parceiros, para nos tornarmos uma empresa mais valiosa também. E com isso, a Microsoft abre a sua plataforma de nuvem, né, faz algumas aquisições, como o próprio LinkedIn, o GitHub e tudo mais, e a sua plataforma hoje, para ser um MVP hoje, você não tem que ser somente de tecnologias Microsoft. A gente tem uma gama de possibilidades aqui. Eu começo listando do lado esquerdo algumas tecnologias de desenvolvimento, como Java, Python, Unity, Xamarin, enfim. Tem uma gama enorme de tecnologias de desenvolvimento, não só .NET, ASP.NET, C++, mas várias outras. Tecnologias muito novas, como Quantum Computing. para quem trabalha com acessibilidade, UX, etc., existem também maneiras de contribuir. Aí, passando por toda a parte de nuvem, de Azure, a parte de AI, os serviços cognitivos, Machine Learning, Bot Services, etc., Dynamics, entrando em CRM, Power Apps, a plataforma Power, pegando Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI, enfim, toda a família Office 365, com uma gama de soluções, a parte de Data Center Management, a parte lá de mão na graxa, mais baixo nível, escovação de bits com PowerShell, enfim, e virtualização, e storage, networking, disponibilidade, alta disponibilidade, segurança. Então, tem uma gama enorme de possibilidades, falando um pouco mais de segurança, Identity and Access, enfim, Remote Desktop Services, Power BI, SQL, entrando na parte de dados todos, MySQL, Postgres, não só o banco de dados SQL Server, o Windows Server em geral, ambientes, não só o Windows, mas também Linux, enfim, a parte de clusters, a parte de, enfim, uma grande gama de Kubernetes, enfim, muitas tecnologias. Eu não consigo nem listar todas aqui na tela, mas é para mostrar que, para ser reconhecido como MVP, você tem algumas possibilidades de contribuição. Especializa, seja muito bom em algumas dessas áreas aí, e eu vou mostrar já já o nosso site, e aí você tem uma grande chance de ser reconhecido. Então, depois de falar do primeiro poder, que é compartilhar, do segundo poder, que é atuar em comunidades, o terceiro poder é ser especialista. Esse é o terceiro poder, super importante, pensando em um dia ser reconhecido pela Microsoft como Microsoft MVP. E aí eu vou pedir licença rapidinho aqui para compartilhar o portal da Microsoft. Deixa eu abrir aqui e colocar na minha tela e vou mostrar para vocês. O nosso programa, né, depois de que um profissional é premiado como Microsoft MVP, ele passa a fazer parte de uma comunidade seleta chamada Microsoft MVP. E, basicamente, aqui a gente tem um portal mvp.microsoft.com. Para aqueles que querem explorar, né, aqui tem um link que mostra um pouco do que eu falei até agora, o que é preciso, né, o que você pode fazer para se tornar um MVP. E aí ele ilustra com alguns exemplos, por exemplo, de MVPs que são que contribuem com códigos para projetos abertos, que ajudam outros, que criam conteúdos, que são palestrantes, que são live coders. Mas eu quero mostrar para vocês aqui um pouco mais da estrutura do evento, né? Essa aqui é a nossa estrutura. O evento ele é organizado em categorias, que a gente chama de Award Categories. Então, atualmente, a gente tem as categorias Microsoft Azure, Windows Development, Office Development, enfim, Developer Technology, Data Plat, AI, e aqui embaixo mais outras. Cloud Data Center Management, Enterprise Mobility, Windows Device for IT, Office Apps and Services e Business Applications. E em cada categoria dessa, você tem as áreas de contribuição. Algumas dessas aqui foi a que eu compartilhei agora há pouco na tela para vocês. E se você é um profissional da área de desenvolvimento de software, foca na sua tecnologia. Se você é um programador front-end, se você é um programador de Node.js, PHP, enfim, foca naquelas contribuições, compartilha conhecimento para a sua comunidade, e aí você vai ter a possibilidade de ser nomeado um dia e registrar essas contribuições. O programa está sempre olhando para os MVPs, para os profissionais de tecnologia, e reconhecendo mensalmente, a gente pode reconhecer ou não profissionais que atinjam seus objetivos, que atinjam o mínimo que é esperado para a gente premiar um MVP. Então, a gente recebe sempre muitas nomeações e mensalmente a gente divulga, uma vez por mês, a gente pode divulgar ou não novos premiados. E para quem já está na comunidade há muito tempo, como os MVPs aqui, participantes do MVP Conf e tudo mais, anualmente a gente repremia os profissionais que continuam contribuindo para a comunidade ou não em alguns casos. Tá? Então, eu convido vocês a navegarem pelo portal de MVPs, conhecerem um pouquinho do que é ser MVP. A gente tem, inclusive, um código de conduta do programa. Então, quais são as expectativas que a Microsoft espera para um MVP, né? E entre elas é o comportamento, é a parte de ser responsável por tudo que está falando e delegando, relacionamento com outras pessoas. A Microsoft tem valores muito fortes, né? Claro que nenhuma discriminação de nenhuma forma, nenhum assédio de nenhuma forma é tolerável e aceitável. E existe um código de conduta, então, do que é ser MVP, que tem um match com os valores Microsoft. Tá? Então, eu convido aqueles que não conhecem ou que querem conhecer um pouco melhor do programa para utilizarem o nosso portal, para entenderem o que é ser MVP. Vocês podem procurar os MVPs aqui, por exemplo, tem uma caixa de consulta aqui, ó, Find an MVP, que você pode, por exemplo, filtrar. Eu quero conhecer todos os MVPs do Brasil. Então, eu venho aqui e coloco, tá em inglês, Brasil com Z, eu vou colocar o país Brasil, acho que não foi, o Brasil aqui, e aí eu vou selecionar os MVPs do Brasil. Deixa eu ver se foi. Não pegou o meu Brasil aqui. Meu Deus, espera aí, não está funcionando o meu filtro nesse momento. Enfim, é como a gente tem um medo de live danada. Deixa eu pegar aqui MVPs de AI, por exemplo. Eu posso selecionar tanto por categoria quanto por país e conhecer aqueles MVPs de uma determinada categoria. Deixa eu ver por que não está aparecendo aqui para mim. Droga. Enfim, eu posso fazer um filtro por países aqui. Nesse momento eu não estou conseguindo, mas enfim, deixa eu deixar só esse recado para vocês aqui. É possível filtrar por região, por categoria, e aí assim você conhecer, por exemplo, quem são os MVPs de Data Plat, do mundo. E o mais legal, quando você encontra um MVP aqui, você pode clicar no seu perfil. Deixa eu pegar aqui o do Alberto, por exemplo, que é um MVP lá do Peru, lá de Lima, que está na nossa comunidade Latam, e você quando clica, você vai ver a biografia daquele MVP, você tem os contatos daquele MVP, as suas redes sociais, quais foram as contribuições principais que ele tem feito para a comunidade. Então, eu convido vocês também a explorarem alguns perfis aqui e a se conectarem com os MVPs. Tá? E se você é MVP, claro, manter o seu perfil sempre atualizado nesse portal também. Então, é importante a gente ter essa consciência que, considerando esses três poderes, o poder de compartilhar, o poder de atuar em comunidade, de forma a considerar valores de diversidade e inclusão, o poder de entender que nas diferenças a gente cresce e não se divide, a capacidade de atuar em comunidades, no sentido de agregar pessoas ao redor de uma causa maior, de um propósito maior, e eu vou dar o exemplo de novo desse evento aqui. Como vocês podem imaginar, qualquer evento que a gente vai organizar, que envolve muita gente, tem dificuldade, tem desafio, e às vezes tem diferenças fortes. O importante é a gente tentar exercitar a alteridade, a empatia, colocar um pouco interesses individuais ou egos de lado em prol do objetivo maior, que nesse caso aqui do MVP Conf é impactar aquelas 7 entidades que eu falei no começo, criar um conteúdo que fica para a posteridade, como as fotos que eu mostrei de 18 e 19, e a gente vai depois ter outras fotos aqui de 2020 também, não com um grupo aglomerado, infelizmente, mas a gente está fazendo mais um capítulo da história. Então, considerando esses três poderes, o poder de compartilhar, o poder de atuar em comunidade e o poder de ser especialista. Para ser MVP, é preciso ser especialista em uma tecnologia de ponta. Com esses três poderes, há uma grande chance de um dia, na sua carreira, você ser reconhecido. O que eu não recomendo é que você fique obcecado por se tornar MVP um dia. Seja obcecado por criar uma comunidade ao seu redor, por compartilhar conhecimento com aqueles que, igual você um dia, não sabiam nada e foram aprendendo com alguém, através de um livro, através de uma apostila, através de um canal do YouTube, através de umas palestras, através de um portal, de uma plataforma que você foi lá e contratou. Enfim, foca nessas pessoas como sua comunidade. Funda uma própria comunidade na sua região, se não tem. Cria comunidades online para poder ter profissionais participando de seus eventos. Os MVPs, como eu, como você, como qualquer um de nós, são pessoas comuns e acessíveis. E com esses valores que eu comentei aqui, de humildade, e percebe, eles têm o valor de estar em comunidade no sangue. Então, são pessoas acessíveis e que participam de vários eventos. E quando a gente fala de poderes, então, eu estou falando que para ser MVP você tem que ter no mínimo esses três poderes. O poder de atuar em comunidade, o poder de compartilhar e o poder de ser especialista. E aí, eu não posso deixar de encerrar, né, sem usar a frase do Uncle Ben aí, do tio Ben do Homem-Aranha, que diz que com grandes poderes vem grandes responsabilidades. A gente nunca pode esquecer disso. Senão o ego infla e aí o que eu era acessível e aberto para a comunidade, eu passo a fazer algo só para o meu próprio ego. Ou eu me sinto superior, eu me sinto mais do que os outros e aí perco os valores mínimos ali de que são esperados para um MVP e o nosso código de conduta, se eu trato de forma desrespeitosa alguém. E não imaginem, né, que a gente tem esses 3.000 MVPs no mundo, são 3.000 pessoas santas, imaculadas. Não, pessoas erram também, seres humanos falham. E a minha função como líder dessa comunidade, da América Latina especialmente, e os meus demais colegas do mundo todo, que também, assim como eu, são Community Program Managers, é liderar essa comunidade, harmonizar essa comunidade e tratar alguns casos isolados em prol do benefício maior da comunidade global de 3.000. A gente tem que parar um pouco com isso, de pegar um caso pontual e jogar como se fosse uma coisa geral, que todo mundo não tem tal valor ou etc. Se eu sou uma pessoa de raça negra e me sentir discriminado por algum colega, por algum profissional, por alguma pessoa, antes de ir para o Twitter reclamar que eu estou sendo perseguido, deixa eu tentar conversar com essa pessoa. Se eu não consigo, aí sim eu vou tentar buscar primeiro, né, seja a empresa, nesse caso aqui, a gente está falando de uma comunidade, quem é o líder da comunidade, quais são os caminhos corretos que a gente pode tentar fazer para melhorar e não para continuar reclamando sem ter uma ação efetiva. Se eu sou uma mulher e me sentir desrespeitada por algum colega, deixa eu procurar primeiro, então, se for no contexto de empresa, alguém, o responsável. Sempre tem, as grandes empresas estão implementando cada vez mais canais para você discutir isso e melhorar. Antes de ir para uma rede social, generalizar a coisa. O mundo, pessoal, ele é formado por muito mais pessoas do bem do que as do mal. E, por vezes, quando a gente acompanha a mídia ou acompanha a rede social, parece que está um caos total. Parece que todo mundo é racista, todo mundo é machista, enfim, sexista. E é importante, eu não estou dizendo que não existe, existe muito. Existe muito racismo no Brasil, muito racismo no mundo. Existe muito sexismo no Brasil, existe muito sexismo no mundo. O importante é, se eu me sentir ofendido, eu quero melhorar como um todo, ou eu quero simplesmente desabafar, né, e jogar publicamente. Então, é importante saber a gente usar o poder da comunidade em prol da comunidade também, a gente se organizar e fazer a coisa correta acontecer da forma correta. Todo mundo quer crescer. Todos os seres humanos aqui que têm grandes poderes, especialmente, e que carregam grandes responsabilidades, podem eventualmente ter um lapso em um momento ou outro. E a gente está aqui para corrigir, para tentar verificar se há alguma coisa imperdoável. A gente vai... Já houve MVPs que saíram da comunidade, que romperam alguma questão do código de conduta e foram convidados a sair. E tem casos que a gente conversa, tenta interagir para melhorar e a comunidade como um todo superar e crescer. Eu acho que esse é o espírito. Mas sempre lembrando, então, que quanto mais alto você está na sua carreira e mais visibilidade você carrega, mais responsabilidade e você tem, né? Responsibility e accountability, usando duas palavras em inglês. Então, queria encerrar com essa questão de poderes e convidar vocês a permanecerem conectados comigo nas redes sociais. Eu compartilhei no começo e em breve, possivelmente final de janeiro, começo de fevereiro, eu vou lançar o meu primeiro livro solo, né, o meu terceiro livro e o meu primeiro solo, que fala do poder do People Chain, que não tem nada a ver com o Microsoft MVP, mas tem a ver com o poder de uma comunidade se mobilizar. E aí eu falo do método Place, que dá para explicar na palma das mãos, onde a gente tem o propósito, que é o que une as pessoas ao redor, a necessidade de liderança numa comunidade, a importância de ter atitude, de querer mudar, de querer transformar nossa sociedade em algo melhor, o comprometimento. Se eu sou membro de uma comunidade, se eu me comprometi com outros colegas para poder executar e organizar um evento tão grande como esse, ou qualquer evento, um meetup na minha região, eu tenho que ter o comprometimento de fazer alguma coisa tal qual eu estivesse fazendo para o meu empregador, para a minha empresa. E por último, a comunidade, os trabalhos em comunidade, precisa pensar na questão da empatia, no encadeamento, que faz a corrente do bem acontecer, que faz a comunidade crescer de forma orgânica. aquilo que conecta, que traz novas pessoas para a comunidade. Então, no Poder do People Chain, eu falo desses 5 passos do método PLACE: propósito, liderança, atitude, comprometimento e empatia. E aí, nesse livro também, a gente tem um pouco da história recente do que eu aprendi com os MVPs da Microsoft. Tem aquela foto bonitona que eu mostrei do MVP Conf do ano passado, com 2.000 pessoas no livro. E eu escrevi sozinho, mas tem 20 relatos de profissionais mais valiosos, alguns MVPs, outros não, que contam o que a comunidade lhes trouxe, lhes impactou, lhe transformou na carreira. Então, fica o convite aí para que vocês conheçam e possam estar conectados comigo e também me dando feedback sobre o livro, que vocês possam vir a ler, tá bom? Então, queria agradecer e deixar aberto aí para perguntas, se a gente tiver. Rafael e Ruschel, temos alguma pergunta, algum comentário?
Excelente, Glauter. Ótima palestra. Se for ver, diversos comentários falando sobre a iniciativa que tu tem feito com a comunidade técnica, com o pessoal MVP e com toda a comunidade em geral, né? Microsoft, muito legal o trabalho, parabéns. E temos algumas perguntas aqui. Uma delas, Glauter, é o pessoal querendo saber como é que funciona esse processo de avaliação, né? Se existe um comitê que avalia as competências, como que é a estrutura do time, como é realizado esse processo de avaliação para o novo MVP e também para o MVP continuar sendo um MVP.
Excelente pergunta, Rafa. E para quem fez aí, basicamente, quando a gente recebe uma nomeação de um profissional para que a gente avalie e premie ou lhes dê um feedback sobre o programa MVP, a gente tem o seguinte: existem 3 grupos que vão analisar um candidato e vão votar favoravelmente ou desfavoravelmente para a premiação. Basicamente, o CPM da região, eu, enquanto Community Program Manager da América Latina, vou dar um voto desses 3, mas eu tenho 2 grupos que suportam a decisão. Um grupo, que tem várias pessoas e que é o grupo de negócios, vai avaliar o conteúdo, o impacto e o conteúdo que o candidato ou a candidata está gerando na comunidade. Basicamente, o que esse grupo de negócio vai olhar? Se os conteúdos produzidos estão alcançando muitas pessoas, ou se aquele candidato fez alguns vídeos, alguns artigos, por exemplo, alguma coisa nesse sentido, mas não tá alcançando muita gente. E aí mostra, se há um impacto baixo de pessoas, mostra que aquele profissional não se tornou uma referência na comunidade ainda, uma autoridade. E aí precisa desenvolver um pouco mais. Então, o grupo de negócios vai olhar esse sentido. BG, Business Group. Vai olhar se o candidato tem um impacto muito grande com o seu canal do YouTube, ou com o seu blog, ou com as suas contribuições através de meetups, de lives. Tá bacana. Então, ele está numa vibe legal. Ao mesmo tempo, as suas redes sociais, ela tem uma presença grande em várias comunidades. Então, esses aspectos são analisados por um time de de negócios, Business Group. O segundo grupo, então eu tenho 2 grupos, Business Group, o grupo de negócios, e o grupo de produtos. O grupo de produtos, ele vai analisar a profundidade técnica. Se os conteúdos gerados, eles são profundos ou se são muito superficiais. A gente, para premiar um MVP da Microsoft, a gente tem que ter uma análise do time de produto e que eles concordando que os conteúdos gerados são conteúdos atuais, conteúdos das tecnologias de ponta e com uma profundidade esperada para um expert. Então, o processo basicamente se resume numa votação que a gente faz, e aí tem um grupo de negócios que olha a amplitude, o impacto que aquele profissional tem na comunidade online e na comunidade presencial, e o outro grupo vai olhar a profundidade técnica, né, de excelência e o tópico que está sendo falado. E o meu terceiro voto é o voto do Community Program Manager, que várias vezes eu conheço um potencial candidato ou vejo quem recomendou, e a gente analisa qual o impacto como um todo que eles estão gerando. Então, existem critérios e existem grupos de produto e de negócio que vão analisar, além do MVP Lead. Muita gente acha que é a minha decisão. Se o Glauter gosta da pessoa, eu premio. Se o Glauter não gosta, não premio. Não é isso. O meu voto é profissional e tem os 2 outros votos também que são computados desses times de produto e de negócio.
Legal, Glauter.
Excelente.
André Ruschel falando, tudo bem? Parabéns pela
apresentação. Ruschel.
Foi muito legal. Eu queria que você deixasse uma mensagem final para o pessoal que está nos assistindo. Qual é a essência desse profissional, digamos, numa frase ou numa palavra? O que caracteriza um verdadeiro não, a essência do MVP seria a palavra, a essência. O que a Microsoft enxerga como a essência desse programa? O que esse profissional, assim, ele caracteriza? Ele é um líder de comunidade? O que seria realmente esse MVP?
Eu acho que a palavra comunidade, ela está muito presente, a palavra compartilhamento está muito presente, e essa atitude de realmente liderar. Quando a gente tem... quando a gente fala muito de... Primeiro, assim, respondendo diretamente a sua pergunta, eu simplifico a essência naqueles 3 poderes que eu citei. O poder de compartilhar, o poder de ser entusiasta, ser apaixonado por tecnologia e estar sempre se especializando. A gente nunca para de estudar, vocês sabem disso. E o terceiro é de saber atuar em comunidade. Para os MVP, para a Microsoft, eu acho que a visão que a empresa tem de um MVP é um profissional que, se ele usa algumas redes sociais, seja o Twitter, seja o GitHub, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitch, qualquer outra, ele se coloca nessas redes sociais como um membro daquela comunidade. Se ele está gerando conteúdo, ele está gerando conteúdo para aqueles membros da sua comunidade. Então, a visão é de que a gente está sempre criando conteúdo para conectar o nosso people chain, a nossa comunidade ao redor. Tá? E com qual espírito? O espírito de ajudar as outras pessoas, espírito de compartilhar aquilo que sabe e aprender com os outros também, e se renovar o tempo todo, e passando pelo nosso código de conduta, de verdade, com respeito, com a mente aberta sobre inclusão e diversidade. Porque quando a gente é diferente, a gente aprende muito mais. Então, esse é a essência de ser um MVP. É um profissional que não está isolado do mundo, é um profissional que está conectado com as pessoas, que está buscando novas conexões sempre, que está buscando se atualizar constantemente e que tem uma paixão muito grande por tecnologia. Tá? Não dá para colocar em uma palavra só, mas essa é a essência, a paixão pela tecnologia, a atuação em comunidade e a visão de sempre compartilhar, não guardar para si a informação.
Perfeito, Glauter. Excelente explicação. Acho que é uma dúvida constante. Eu tentei resumir aqui, porque nós tivemos várias perguntas que vão desde como ser um MVP, como se tornar, como é que faz, enfim, eu acho que você conseguiu contextualizar muito bem e também deixar bem claro como que funciona essa premiação que a Microsoft realiza anualmente, né? Como você já falou, para todos os MVPs brasileiros. Uma outra pergunta aqui que o pessoal fez, eu acho que é pertinente. Quantos MVPs tem no Brasil hoje?
Então, a gente tem 146 MVPs no Brasil, exatamente. Tem alguns brasileiros que não estão morando mais aqui, que estão morando fora, mas que são brasileiros. Então, quase 150. E na América Latina, cerca de 50, tá? E pegando até, estava vendo uma pergunta aqui, ó, sobre, em média, quanto tempo leva, né, para fazer essa avaliação de um profissional. A gente tem um objetivo de tentar dar um feedback em até no máximo 90 dias. Né? Se você recebeu uma nomeação por algum MVP ou por algum funcionário da Microsoft e entrou para a nossa fila, no fundo, assim, como é que funciona? Rapidinho para o pessoal. Quando você recebe uma nomeação, aquela pessoa que te nomeou no nosso portal vai disparar uma thread que você vai receber um e-mail. Quando você recebe um e-mail, você tem a possibilidade de criar o seu perfil. E aí você fica o tempo que você quiser para criar o perfil, dizendo tudo que você fez nos últimos anos, né, especialmente nos últimos 12 meses, com a comunidade, mostrando o impacto, qual a quantidade de pessoas que você alcançou em cada contribuição. Quando você termina o seu perfil e envia para a gente, e compartilha para a Microsoft, a gente recebe e aí passa a contar um período de 90 dias para te dar um feedback. Seja um feedback dizendo, apontando só para você que pontos você pode melhorar na sua jornada em busca de ser reconhecido, ou a premiação. Todos os meses a gente premia, né, tem a data para premiar os novos MVPs, que é o primeiro dia de cada mês, e tem meses que a gente premia um MVP, 2, em outubro a gente premiou 10 aqui na América Latina, e tem meses que a gente não premia ninguém, né, mas a gente está sempre recebendo um monte de nomeação e dando feedback para os candidatos. Tá? Então, em média, o prazo é de no máximo 3 meses, mas tem gente que pode mandar um perfil, submeter um perfil, e calhado a gente analisar ali rapidamente num ciclo e pode ser premiado no mês seguinte. Tá? Todos os meses a gente pode ou não premiar novos MVPs, e os MVPs atuais, eles são repremiados ou não uma vez por ano. Ele é um prêmio anual.
Perfeito, Glauter. Eu acho que com isso encerramos essa belíssima apresentação. Você nos trouxe aí informações pertinentes ao programa, desmistificando também, porque às vezes a nossa audiência ela precisa conhecer o que esse MVP faz, a essência, né, como você nos trouxe hoje aqui, né, e deixar claro que também, né, Glauter, esses MVPs, eles não são funcionários da Microsoft, né, eles são premiados.
Dois recadinhos finais para a gente poder concluir, mas bem rápido. Primeiro, esse bom ponto que você lembrou, Ruxo. MVP, ele não é funcionário da Microsoft. Inclusive, quando um MVP é contratado pela Microsoft, ele deixa de ser MVP. Então, é um prêmio para influenciadores globais externos à Microsoft. E vocês, né, MVPs, os MVPs, não trabalham para a Microsoft. A relação de trabalho é outra. Apesar de muitos me chamarem de chefe, né, mas de forma carinhosa, de respeito e, ao mesmo tempo, de um tom descontraído, os MVPs trabalham com a Microsoft. É uma relação de trabalhar com, ao invés de trabalhar para. Tá? Esse é um primeiro recado que eu queria. Foi boa você levantar esse ponto. O segundo, a gente tem hoje, depois da minha aqui, uma trilha de vários outros MVP Leads que passaram por aqui e vão contar um pouco mais essa história numa época que nem tinha internet. Então, Leonardo Tolomelli, JP, Fernanda Saraiva, o Nestor, o Rodolfo, outras pessoas que passaram pela posição que eu estou hoje, com muito orgulho, e que vão contar um pouco da história também para vocês aí, para os MVPs que queiram conhecer e assistir, e também para todo mundo que está participando da comunidade. Então é isso que eu queria deixar. E aí, para fechar, eu não coloquei na minha apresentação, mas uma frase do nosso tio Bill, né, de Bill Gates, uma das que eu mais gosto, ele diz o seguinte: se você quer chegar onde a maioria não chega, faça o que a maioria não faz. A gente às vezes vê o pessoal tentando repetir uma forma de sucesso. Eu vou fazer tudo que o Ruschel faz ou que o Rafael faz para um dia ser MVP também. Não faça isso. Crie alguma coisa para a sua comunidade, faça algo diferente e se torne um profissional mais valioso pelas suas singularidades e não tentando copiar outra pessoa. Faça o que a maioria das pessoas não faz e aí você vai chegar onde a maioria não chega. Tamo junto? Obrigado mais uma vez pelo convite. De novo, reforço o convite para todo mundo que está aqui online, que siga nessa trilha aqui, prestigiando Leonardo Tolomelli, Fernanda Saraiva, JP, Rodolfo Roim, Nestor e muitas histórias sobre esse programa maravilhoso, que tem 27 anos.
Perfeito, Glauter. Com isso, encerramos a sua apresentação. Foi um sucesso, muito obrigado mesmo de coração e convidamos a nossa audiência que acompanhe as palestras ao longo do dia. Nós vamos até às 20 horas hoje e teremos ainda um sorteio, né? O sorteio dos Xbox no final do evento. Então, tem muito conteúdo bacana ao longo do dia. Essa sessão que você falou aí dos ex-MVPs Leads, eu acho que vai ser muito legal também. Então, está todo mundo convidado. A gente vai colocar agora uma vinheta final aí do evento. Até porque você, Glauter, está encerrando o terceiro e último dia de Keynotes, onde nós tivemos convidados ilustríssimos, né? Inclusive alguns com presenças inéditas, mesmo que seja de forma virtual, num evento da comunidade MVP brasileira. Eu acho que isso é importante ressaltar, né? Nunca nós conseguimos aí trazer esses profissionais aí, como já passaram aqui por onde você está apresentando hoje. Então, com certeza, isso mostra que o time de MVPs da Microsoft no Brasil e da América Latina, que hoje são liderados por você, Glauter, Jannuzzi, estão todos de parabéns. E que também deixar claro para a nossa audiência que ninguém faz nada sozinho. Nós somos um time muito grande, tem muitas pessoas envolvidas aí nos bastidores para que esse evento esteja acontecendo. Então, a força de cada um de nós, com certeza, é que garante o sucesso desse evento. Glauter, muito obrigado mais uma vez.
Parabéns a vocês, Ruschel. Você se lembrou muito bem e usando essa última frase que eu já falei aqui do Bill Gates, vocês fizeram isso, quer dizer, com todas as adversidades que a gente teve em 2020, né? Vocês se mobilizaram para fazer um evento diferente, a primeira versão online, e aproveitando que o evento é online, a gente consegue ter pessoas que estão de qualquer parte do mundo, Scott Hanselman, Mark Russinovich, vários outros que passaram por aqui, participando ativamente desse evento. Então, isso é muito bacana de ver como vocês fizeram diferente, estão chegando, né, a atingir um resultado que poucos atingem. Parabéns de verdade. É um grande orgulho a gente estar participando de mais um capítulo dessa história linda do MVP Conf, da comunidade MVP Brasil e América Latina. E isso aqui está gravado, vai ficar na nossa cápsula do tempo. Eu espero de verdade que daqui a um ano, daqui a 12 meses, em dezembro de 2021, a gente esteja apto a estar se aglomerando de novo para fazer um MVP Conf ainda mais bacana, com todo mundo que está aqui, chamando aqueles convidados de longe para virem também, para pegar os seus voos e virem para o Brasil. Espero de verdade que 2021 seja especial e que a gente possa voltar a se abraçar com tanto carinho aí, fraternidade que a gente tem na comunidade. Valeu, obrigado de verdade, parabéns a todos vocês. Bom demais te ver aí também na câmera, Rafa. Abração.